Sergeyev, previously known as Sigorsk, was the heart of the religious Old Russia, the center of the patriarch of the Russian Church. One decrepit wing of the old monastery serves as the unique place of refuge for the past great figures of the Soviet Union, a historical attic. The all-powerful Stalin in plaster, granite, and bronze. His predecessor, Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, and their most important comrade. One who should be here is Leon Trotsky. Shortly before he was murdered on Stalin's orders, he wrote, "History's revenge is far more horrific than the most powerful general secretary, and I venture to believe that this is somehow reassuring." History's horrific vengeance has finally caught up with the all-powerful General Secretary, Stalin, as well as his predecessor Lenin.
What meaning did Stalin have for Soviet society? For decades, there were tens of thousands of monuments to Stalin across the country, then known as the Soviet Union. We looked at them and thought, Stalin is the Lenin of our time. Later, in 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, when Khrushchev courageously stripped the leader of his honors, it appeared to us that Stalin had mocked Lenin. However, a short time ago, we gained access to the Lenin archives. We read 3,724 letters handwritten by Lenin, which until then had been kept secret. Then we finally realized, in fact, Stalin had truly been the Lenin of our time. Stalin carried on Lenin's reign of violence. Stalin carried on building a totalitarian state. Stalin applied terrorism as state policy. This propaganda, which we regarded as an ugly totalitarian deformity, proved to be the real thing. Stalin was truly the Lenin of our time. Lenin had been considered a humane, great, noble, and proud revolutionary, but today we know he was like Stalin, and Stalin was like Lenin. They were nearly identical, but I would say that Stalin exceeded Lenin.
Georgia, between Europe and Asia. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was still a land of knights and bandits. 76 kilometers from the capital Tbilisi lies Gori on the Transcaucasian Railway. Here lived the shoemaker Vissarion Chugashvili and his wife Ekaterina. Their first two sons died in infancy. The third son, Yusuf, or Joseph, was born on the 21st of December, 1879. His mother nicknamed him Soso. At the age of 5, little Soso became ill with smallpox. He almost died. The illness would scar him for life. Yosef, a top student, was strongly influenced by his pious mother. She had to care for the boy alone. The father had left the family to work in a shoe factory. This is the only known film of Stalin's mother. It was made in 1932, after Soso had long become a globally important figure. From her earnings as a cleaning woman, she paid the tuition for the church school, which Soso attended for 5 years. The mother's dreams came true when church leaders in Gori informed her the boy had been accepted to attend the seminary in Tbilisi. A few years later, Yosif Chugashvili was expelled from the seminary. At 19, he assumed his first underground code name, Koba the Unbending. Half Marxist, half Robin Hood, and like other 19-year-old romantics, he wanted to fight against the suffering and repression of the masses. The suffering was great across the vast empire of the Tsars. The poet Ivan Bunin once said, "Russia is a village." 4 out of 5 Russians lived in the countryside. It was only the grandparents of these peasants who were freed from serfdom, yet they remained poor because of the high cost of paying taxes and buying land. Their average life expectancy was around 30 years. They sought refuge from their suffering in religion. In death, they hoped to find the salvation they could not find in life. The state church, as a pillar of the Tsarist regime, was not well loved, but the people piously followed its teachings into a world of saints and miracles. The Russian peasantry lived in the Middle Ages. They believed in angels and devils. Their narcotic was vodka, the opium of the people. Many impoverished peasants, including women, worked for large landowners or moved into cities to work in factories. Wages were low, and the social conditions were catastrophic. Nicholas II, Tsar of Russia, the lone ruler in a multicultural empire of 130 million people, master over 1/6 of the planet. The Tsar saw himself as being in the service of God. He was far above the people, both in his own mind and in the minds of his subjects. This weak and insecure man represented Tsar's autocracy, a ruling system which had long been superseded. Receptions, ceremonies, parades. The pageantry of the imperial court continued to blind most of the Tsar's subjects. Yet things were starting to crumble beneath the surface. Court officials, driven purely by their own egos, were mired in cliques and intrigues. The Tsar relied on a reactionary bureaucracy and 3 pillars of power: the Orthodox state church, the landowning nobility, and an extensive police network. Nicholas II closed his eyes to the problems, which increasingly drove Russian society towards revolution. The opposition was brutally repressed. Political inmates were sent to prison, including Yosif Chugashvili. He was constantly changing his aliases since he went underground in March of 1901 as a professional revolutionary. The police called him Ryobue, or the Scarred One, because of his pocked face. 1905 in St. Petersburg, soldiers shot on a peaceful demonstration by workers in front of the Imperial Palace. 130 people were killed and more than 1,000 others were wounded. This bloody Sunday was like a fuse and a powder keg. Demonstrations, strikes, and peasant unrest broke out across the Russian Empire. The revolution failed. The dominance of the Tsars appeared unshakable, though people still mocked the Tsar in this ditty. The frightened Tsar issued a manifest: liberate the dead and imprison the rest. The Tsar's mother had a grim idea of what was to come when she saw the revolutionaries. She said their faces reflected a unique hate against all of us, which I could not understand. I was filled with fear. Will we be able to prevent another revolutionary outbreak to put them down? London, 1907. The Russian Social Democrats meet in an English church. Yosif Chugashvili represents Georgia in the Bolshevik faction, which is led by Lenin. The persecuted leaders of Russia's socialists live in exile in Western Europe. At the 1912 Party Congress in Prague, Lenin manages to have the 32-year-old Chugashvili elected in absentia to the membership of the Central Committee. This is a great honor for the Georgian, who is on the run inside Russia. He is now part of the leadership of the small but self-confident Revolutionary Party. He now calls himself Stalin, the Steel One. His first political activities as a member of the Central Committee take him to the oil fields of Baku, the center of the Caspian oil-producing region. He was sent to this, the largest oil-producing area in the world, to help build up the Bolshevik Party organization. The region has more than enough potential for a social explosion. Azeris, Russians, and Armenians live together here in tight quarters under the worst conditions. They are trying to make it big in the region's booming oil industry. They are also in constant conflict with each other. Shootings and robberies are common occurrences. Stalin attempts to divert this internal strife against the Tsarist authorities. In March of 1908, he is once again arrested by the police. Through wanted posters, he achieves a certain degree of notoriety among both his comrades as well as the police. Stalin is sent into exile 1,000 miles north of Moscow to Sovichegos. A cathedral and a monastery church are reminders of better times. In the 16th century, the town was a bustling trading center for salt and furs. Stalin remains here for a year and a half before he flees back to Baku. In 1910, he is again arrested and exiled to Sovichegos. Stalin's comings and goings are recorded in his landlady's register book under orders by the police, whom usually did not concern themselves with the exiles. Stalin's signature at the end of his second period of exile in June of 1911. 7 arrests and 5 escapes, Stalin's proud record in his life as a professional revolutionary. Later in life, Stalin often referred to his life in the underground when speaking with his comrades. He called that time a genuine Bolshevik baptism of fire and the forge of a steel revolutionary will. The Tsar pursued his pleasures as if all was well inside Russia. The glitter of life in the imperial court gave a deceptive glow to grim reality. A charity event in the Crimea organized by women from the nobility to help orphans of the gentry. But there are no rubles to alleviate the misery facing the peasants and the workers. Such charity never even occurs to the powers that be. Russia is very big and the Tsar is far away. Too far away for him to appreciate the suffering of the Russian peasantry. For the Tsar's family and the nobility, the peasantry only exists as a kind of exotic background. One approaches them with good intentions. The children of the Tsar's family learn from them how to receive gestures of total submission. Life in the imperial court helps forget how impassably deep the differences are between the Lord of all Russians and his people. Stalin is sent to the capital, St. Petersburg. Under Lenin's orders, he is to implement a politically hard line at the party newspaper, Pravda, or Truth. But Stalin fails and is soon replaced. Once again, he is arrested and sent back into exile, this time to Siberia. Previously, he had been in Krakow and Vienna, the only long periods of time he spent abroad, where he wrote the essay, Marxism and the National Question, a sort of doctoral thesis for the professional revolutionary. Stalin was sentenced to the mildest form of exile. At the time, he found it amusing that the police provided his living expenses. He joked that the Tsarist regime was financing its own gravediggers. This taught Stalin that strong power requires unmerciful organs of punishment. August 1914, Germany declares war on Russia. The Tsar and the Russian people place their faith in the power of the army, the much vaunted Russian steamroller. With the blessing of the Orthodox Church, the Tsar's army goes off to war. A patriotic spirit breaks out. Large numbers of Russians volunteer for military service. Russian peasants leave homes, farms, and families behind to escape the misery of their everyday lives. Their single collective hope is that everything will be better after the war has ended in a Russian victory. Though poorly trained and poorly armed, they are sent to the front. They must also confront dismissive officers who look down at them. One general told his officers, "Take as much of this scum as you need and deal with them." Without the support of artillery, the soldiers are ordered to attack German trenches. While the officers receive medals, mountains of dead soldiers remain on the battlefields. Stalin lives far from this war. His plan is to wait. He does not even attempt to flee from his place of exile. He relaxes by hunting and fishing. His revolutionary activities give way to a Siberian hibernation. A photo from this time depicts him as a happy early pensioner of the revolution. A museum was built over the shacks of the exiles later on. A woman who lives in the area remembers.
They were camp prisoners. They received no pay for their work. It would have cost too much to use paid construction workers. They lived in special barracks 2.5 kilometers from our village. They were brought in at 8 o'clock in the morning and picked up at 8 in the evening. There were no big construction machines at the time, no cranes, no bulldozers. They were only shovels and spades. They began building the museum using shovels, a tall building made of steel and concrete. In one of the halls there was the hut in which Stalin had lived. Inside there was a table with an open copy of Das Kapital by Karl Marx on the table. Next to it was a wooden stool marred by notches from gun cartridges. It was clear Comrade Stalin went hunting. He did not have his own weapon, but he was always able to borrow one from one of the locals. The villagers liked him. He healed the sick with various natural herbs. He even went dancing and danced the quadrille with an old woman who, sadly, has since died. I don't know if it was just a rumor that he had a son here, a rumor, but the old people always insisted that he really had a son here. The village of Kuraika, which is now seen as a place of historical importance, used to receive steamships full of people for 2 hours, exactly 2 hours. They worshipped the museum like a god. When Stalin's cult of personality was revealed, a decision was made to destroy the museum. Later, they took Stalin's hut somewhere, as well as the exhibition items which had been on display. For example, these books of the works of Comrade Stalin. They were destroyed, burned. But we did not see this. There were also many recordings that were also destroyed. They were records of Comrade Stalin's speeches.
A former camp guard visits the place even now.
It must have been here. The house stood on this foundation like an inverted letter L. And this is where his personal things were, various hunting instruments and stocks. The bed stood here. Here was a portrait. See this place exactly here. 4-5 centimeters thick, made from bronze. You know, like a bas-relief is made of bronze. And where did he stand? A pedestal was there on which there stood a statue which was so high, white. Made of marble? No, probably from plaster, because every year part of it was painted to make it look better. In one hand a newspaper, the other tucked into his tunic. No hat, in a coat. The statue was really beautiful.
The Russian army suffered one defeat after the other. By February 1917, Russia had lost 8 million soldiers, dead, missing, wounded, prisoners of war. The situation worsened from day to day. One soldier wrote from the front, "We're being killed like insects. It is horrific, either by cholera or from the war. It is something to get away from." Stalin continued to go hunting in exile, thousands of kilometers away from the war. The senseless dying on the front and the hunger at home prompted Petrograd's women to take to the streets in February of 1917. The women were poorly organized and politically untested, but radical in their demands. Down with the Tsar of hunger. They were joined by workers. More than 200,000 strikers demanded an end to the war. The sign, supplier to the imperial court, aroused the anger of the hungry mob. Police and soldiers who should have put down the unrest instead joined the protesters. The Tsar was becoming ever less powerful. On the 27th of February, there was not a single regiment in Petrograd which still supported the old regime. The writer Sklovsky described the atmosphere as a combination of Easter and a happy, innocent celebration. People stormed the Palace of Justice, the Arsenal, and the Peter and Paul Fortress. All inmates were freed, and not just the political prisoners. The general atmosphere is exhilarating. Soon files were burning in the headquarters of the Tsar's notorious police, the Okhrana. The Tsar abdicated at the beginning of March 1917. The February Revolution swept away the 300-year dynasty of the Romanovs. A sort of double ruling order emerged in Russia. On one side, the provisional government, on the other, the freely elected councils or Soviets. Exiles and immigrants returned to the capital. They wanted to use the moment to push for a revolution. But the war was still raging, and it was not clear who was in control of the ship of state. Stalin also returned to Petrograd. The Central Committee put he and Kamenev in charge of the party newspaper, Pravda. Stalin was named editor-in-chief. Lenin heard of the victorious February Revolution while in exile in Switzerland. The German government provided transportation back to Petrograd for 31 other Russian socialists. The Germans had hoped to end the war on the Eastern Front with Lenin's help. The plan looked promising. Upon his return, Lenin announced his program, the so-called April Theses. He called for an end to the war, called for non-cooperation with the provisional government, and appealed for power to the councils and support for the Soviets. Early July 1917, spontaneous mass demonstrations in Petrograd forced the Bolsheviks into action. They half-heartedly joined the demonstrations out of fear that the revolution would happen without them. They call for the overthrow of the government, which defends itself by deploying troops. The revolt breaks down, the party is banned, and its leaders face arrest. Stalin is concerned about Lenin's life. He hides the wanted Lenin, and with the help of a forged passport, organizes his escape to neighboring Finland. Stalin is also the connection between Lenin and the party. Leo Bronstein, also known as Trotsky, has recently returned from exile in New York. A famous revolutionary, he was the chairman of the Petersburg Soviets during the revolution in 1905. A member of the Bolsheviks for only a few days, he is automatically accepted into the party Central Committee. The presentation of the new Central Committee members is done alphabetically so that Stalin appears alongside Trotsky. The men are enemies from the beginning. Trotsky becomes chairman of the Petrograd Soviets. He relentlessly attacks the provisional government and especially the prime minister, Alexander Kerensky. Trotsky claims the government must be overthrown because Kerensky wants to hand revolutionary Petrograd over to the Germans. Trotsky plans to lead a military uprising. 40,000 Red Guards take to the streets. Radical sailors from Kronstadt join the revolt. Kerensky has control over only a handful of people to defend the Winter Palace, which serves as the seat of the provisional government. The bourgeois republic is defended by a women's battalion, cadets, and a few Cossacks. Defenders of the government set up wooden barricades around the Winter Palace. A chronology of events. The night before the 25th of October, Trotsky wins the support of forces occupying the Peter and Paul Fortress. The 25th of October, the cruiser Aurora anchors near the Winter Palace. Red Guards occupy key positions in the capital. Kerensky leaves Petrograd in a car provided by the American embassy. In the evening, the Winter Palace is stormed. The government is arrested in the early hours of October 26. The general population sees no major signs the government has fallen. In the evening of the revolution, theaters are open, concerts are performed, and streetcars are running. A shattered window in the Winter Palace, one of the few signs of the great socialist October Revolution. Handbills are prepared. They read, "Citizens of Russia, state power is now in the hands of the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviets. Our goals are an immediate peace, distribution of property, and workers' control over the means of production." A few years after the October Revolution, Leon Trotsky, one of its organizers, is a non-person in the Soviet Union. There are no longer photos of him, his name is not mentioned, and credible reports about the October Revolution are no longer available. Stalin's role during the actual revolution remains unclear. The historical truth soon becomes a legend which became more pompous as it was frequently more celebrated. Each year, this most important holiday of the Soviet year was celebrated in all cities, villages, institutions across the Red Empire. The glitter of the parades overshadowed the historical truth and concealed memory. With each year, even Lenin receded more into the shadows. The great planner and strategist of the Great Revolution now had a new name, Joseph Stalin. The day following the revolt, Russia had a new government. The Council of People's Commissars. Lenin was its chairman. The Georgian, Stalin, became the People's Commissar for National Questions. His background seemed to recommend him for the position. As someone from the Caucasus, he was charged with maintaining calm among the peoples who lived on the periphery of the Russian Empire. The Council of People's Commissars' first act of business was to promise peace to the masses. Their second decree called for handing the properties of large landowners over to the peasantry. Soldiers at the front did not want to miss the redistribution of land. They simply quit the front and went home.
The Bolsheviks promised the people peace, bread, and land. At first glance, this appeared to be a good idea, but it eventually became clear that without freedom, these important things, peace, bread, and land, were only illusions, because freedom is indivisibly connected to human development and a primary quality of such development. Stalinistic socialism produced only the freedom of violence and terror, a freedom which led a broad society in a huge country to a historical dead end.
Early March 1918, British warships set a course for the polar seaport of Murmansk. Behind this intervention stood the British Minister for War, Winston Churchill. He detested the new Soviet regime. Churchill said, "Bolshevism is not politics. It is a plague. It is not a belief. It is an infection." 120,000 Japanese occupied the harbor at Vladivostok. The Americans arrived in the Far East. There were soon 200,000 foreign troops from 14 nations on Russian soil. Their goal was to overthrow the Bolshevik government. In the west, German troops occupied the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Zoya Fedorovna experienced the confusion as a 10-year-old girl.
Я помню еще оккупацию немецкими войсками 18-го года.
I clearly recall the German occupation in 1918. At this time I attended school in the provincial town of Gluchov. After the Germans, there were a series of others: anarchists, Chinese troops, Latvian units, and the White Army. I remember this time very well. Sometimes we children were herded into cellars because of the shooting. There was heavy fighting. Then came the time of cold and hunger. We sat in the classroom wearing our coats and holding our inkwells in our hands so the ink would not freeze. I was a young girl in Moscow when the new economic policy began and started to earn my own money. Other people did the same and began to realize there was another way to live.
И держали чернильницу в руке, чтобы не замерзал чернила.
The Germans were moving on Petrograd. This forced the Soviets to accept the terms dictated by the Germans in the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty. Russia lost 1/3 of its population and half of its natural resources. Lenin set the Red Army regiments against the enemy.
Comrades, the capitalists of England, America and France are waging war against Russia. With money and munitions, they support Russian property owners who, from Siberia, are sending troops against the Soviet government. Comrades, be strong, honorable and united. Forward against the enemy. Victory will be ours. Property owners and capitalists will be defeated around the globe.
Leon Trotsky, the new commissar for war, created the Red Army. He did not think that the Soviet regime could be defended only by partisans and worker militias. Within 2 years, 5 million men were under arms, a major success. However, soldiers' councils and the free election of officers, both products of the revolution, were soon discontinued. Discussion was once again replaced by orders. A famous original photo. In a fighting pose, Lenin sends Red Guardsmen to the front during the Civil War. Stalin later had the photo doctored. Long before he was murdered, Trotsky's image was erased from such photos and portraits. Leon Trotsky, the chairman of the Revolutionary War Council, at this time his fame rivaled that of Lenin. Without a break, the World War became a civil war, Reds fighting Whites. The Civil War was the real baptism of fire for the Soviet regime, the real revolution. The Red Army's main opponent was the former Tsarist officer, Admiral Kolchak. The Whites controlled 4 large armies under the command of Tsarist generals. Additionally, there were an innumerable number of small militia units and armed bands, all with a colorful collection of goals and plans. As usual, it was the ordinary people who suffered the most. Today the Reds, tomorrow the Whites, the next day the Bandits. The poet Isaac Babel wrote, "Why will my melancholy not ease? Life flees from it. It is like one big ongoing funeral." Fighting was intense and bitter on both the front and behind the lines. There were very few prisoners. At stake was both individual survival and the survival of the state. In the autumn of 1919, the Bolsheviks did not control even 1/10 of the old Tsarist Empire. Stalin warned that a victory won by Kolchak would turn Russia into a milk cow, which would generate sacks of gold for the French and the British. 200 kilometers from Moscow stood the army of the White General Denikin. Petrograd, the cradle of the revolution, was also in danger of falling to the Whites. From Estonia came troops under the command of General Yudenich. He commanded elite units of the former Tsarist army who had been freed from German prison camps. The British amply supplied Yudenich with weapons, ammunition, and vehicles. Confident of victory, the Whites carried blacklists with them. After defeating the Bolsheviks in Petrograd, the Whites planned to settle accounts with the Reds. The Whites were at the gates of the city as the Reds mobilized the remaining reserves. Lenin wanted to surrender the city, a move opposed by Trotsky. He demanded that the city be defended until the last drop of Bolshevik blood had been shed, and that until then no territory would be lost. He succeeded in turning the tide of battle. For this he was decorated with the Order of the Red Banner. Stalin also received such an honor despite the fact that he spent this time at a desk. The actual dirty work of the war he left up to others.
A relentless fire burns and rages inside me for my Russia, the new Messiah of the coming day.
With these words, the poet Alexander Blok used national pathos to warm the hearts of the Red Guard during the bitterness of the Civil War. Senior Commander Trotsky lived in an armor-plated train and controlled the 8,000-kilometer-long front with an iron hand. He announced that one cannot send masses of men to their death without having executions in the arsenal. With special powers issued by Lenin, Stalin was sent to Tsaritsyn on the Volga. His job was to secure food stocks. He energetically took on the job. A propaganda newspaper depicted Stalin in the thick of the fighting near Tsaritsyn. The city would later carry his name, Stalingrad. He guided Voroshilov, the commander of the 10th Army. He also established close ties with Bujani, the legendary commander of the 1st Cavalry, as well as with a political commissar called Ordzhonikidze. These relationships would serve Stalin well in his rise to power. Stalin, the administrator, would later be stylized into a path-breaking military leader. Still, the hero of the Civil War was Leon Trotsky. At the beginning of 1920, the Western powers left their white Russian allies in the lurch. Following the Red Army's victory, Winston Churchill took the long view. He said, like other great plagues which have confronted humanity, this one will also die out with or without the help of the outside world. The last white forces fought in southern Russia under Wrangel, a baron from the Baltics. Fearing revenge attacks by the Reds, hundreds of thousands of Russians saw immigration as their only salvation. They left behind a devastated land. After 6 years of war, Russia was at the end of its rope. Industrial production sank to below 1/6 of what it had been in 1913. Ironworks and steel mills were at a standstill. Metal production was at its lowest point since Peter the Great, some 200 years earlier. People face hunger in both the city and the country. Bread rations in Petrograd were at 50 grams per day. Catastrophe was approaching. The Bolsheviks resorted to violence. So-called wheat battalions were created using soldiers and workers. These then plundered peasant food stocks in what Lenin called a holy war for foodstuffs. Stalin's experience during the Civil War had an influence on his future actions.
Stalin never flinched from using violence. That's something he learned during the Civil War. Few people know that 13 million people died in the Civil War. Since that time, Stalin believed that every problem could be solved through violence. Collectivization, industrialization, and problems associated with the intelligentsia were all issues he sought to resolve through violence.
Those uprooted by the Civil War without food or shelter moved hungrily from place to place looking for sustenance. Cholera and typhus were widespread. Death became a common occurrence. The Soviet regime produced an album of salvation to soften the hearts of their sworn enemies, the capitalists. Sergei Yesenin wrote about this time. If the hunger gets to be too much, I'll bite into myself and eat half my leg, and you can have the rest. In the truest sense of the word, peasants were transformed into cannibals. Unrest became widespread. The poet Boris Pilnak wrote, "Hunger drags itself through the city. People are becoming wild, fantasizing about bread and potatoes. The red pulsing life has left the city, to be followed by the white life of paper, death. The Red Sailors of Kronstadt rose up. The Red Army attacked the naval base near Petrograd. Trotsky sent 60,000 Red Guardsmen into the battle. The revolt began on March 2nd, 1921. The battleship Peter and Paul became the headquarters to the 16,000 rebellious sailors who now set their sights on the Soviet regime. In 1917, Kronstadt was the Bolsheviks' backbone, home port of the legendary cruiser Aurora. 4 years later, in 1921, the rebelling sailors once again issued demands for more democracy. These included new elections of the councils, since the current Soviets do not reflect the wishes of the workers or the peasants, freedoms of speech, the press, and of assembly, the release of all political prisoners. This hit the Soviet regime in its most sensitive point. They then labeled the former vanguard of the revolution to be counter-revolutionaries, to justify the massive use of force to put down the rebellion. After 10 days of intense fighting, Kronstadt fell to Soviet forces. Their commander, Tukhachevsky, reported to Moscow, "Kronstadt has quit breathing." Socialist kisses of brotherhood for the heroes of Kronstadt, seen from the side of the victors. The losers faced a dismal fate. After capitulating, all were imprisoned, some were deported, and many were shot. Signs of the battle were removed from the streets of Kronstadt. There were so many killed that they had to be buried in mass graves. In Russia, these are called brother graves. Around the world, the military action against the Kronstadt sailors led many disappointed socialists to turn their backs on the Soviet regime. A few days later, the victory celebration in Moscow on Red Square. Tukhachevsky thanks his troops, a bitter victory for the Red Army. All enemies of the Bolsheviks now know that one risks one's own life if they try to challenge the power of the Soviet state. Lenin tries to justify the hard line against the strikers and protesters as necessary to defend socialism. Leon Trotsky also contributed to this victory. It would be one of his final victory celebrations. 1922. Stalin is still relatively unknown, although he sits on the party's most important body and is named General Secretary of the party. Many revolutionaries dismiss the post as a job for a bureaucrat. Lenin helped him reach this position. Lenin needed Stalin's iron hand. As the People's Commissar for National Questions, Stalin brutally put down independence movements even in his Georgian homeland. On paper, the states are referred to as independent and allowed self-determination, but in reality, the Bolsheviks were brutal in bringing wayward nations under the banner of the hammer and sickle. Gorky near Moscow. This is where Lenin died on the 21st of January 1924. The brutal civil war and the setbacks which followed it had left the Soviet Union's founder pessimistic. A year before his death, he evaluated the situation and stated, "We face a test as we emerge from the suffering, the misery, the ruins, and how we face this test will determine everything." Stalin was a constant presence in Gorky to visit the dying Lenin. The Politburo ordered Stalin to see that Lenin did not overexert himself. Now it was up to him, Stalin, who would be allowed to see the fading Lenin. It was a critical role which Stalin used to his own advantage. The Bolsheviks managed to overcome some problems during Lenin's lifetime. They defeated their enemies in the Civil War. They were able to curb hunger, and destroyed industrial areas began slowly to recover. But as Lenin was buried, so was any hope of democracy for the Soviet councils. The dictatorship of the proletariat became a dictatorship of the party, and would soon become the dictatorship of the party leadership. A huge bureaucratic colossus began to emerge. Policy was carried out according to General Secretary Stalin. Lenin recognized this on his deathbed and warned in a letter to the party Congress, "Comrade Stalin has concentrated immeasurable power in his hands since becoming General Secretary, and I am not convinced that he always understands that this power must be exercised with caution." A wake was held for Lenin in Moscow, with his party comrades keeping a vigil over the body. Radek, the journalist, the German Clara Zetkin, Zinoviev, a brilliant speaker and theorist, Tukhachevsky, the gifted military leader, Kamenev, the chief editor of Pravda, Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka secret police, and Stalin, who is committed to join the contest to become Lenin's successor.
We historians often debate the question, what would have happened if someone other than Stalin had followed Lenin? What if it had been Bukharin, Rykov, Kamenev, or Frunze? I believe the person himself would have played no great role. Why? Because the totalitarian system which Lenin helped create was a strictly one-party monopoly in both power and thought, which would eventually have produced someone like Stalin. Another dictator, another leader might have been found, but who also would have been strong-willed and shown no mercy or respect for humanitarian principles. And that is why Stalin was ideal for this system. Certainly, Trotsky was educated, a brilliant thinker. Bukharin was also educated. Rykov and Kamenev had great intellectual capabilities as writers and publicists. But it was Stalin who won out, and that was no accident. The system, by its nature, required a merciless, tough, determined and decisive leader, and Stalin met all of these requirements. Again, if not Stalin, then someone very similar. The sister demanded a Stalin based on the system created by Lenin.
5 days after Lenin's death, the Second Soviet Congress agrees to display Lenin's body in perpetuity in a mausoleum on Red Square. Stalin makes a public vow during Lenin's funeral.
As Comrade Lenin leaves us, he also leaves behind a legacy to maintain the good name and purity of the party, to defend the unity of party as if our lives depended on it, to protect and secure the dictatorship of the proletariat. Comrade Lenin, we swear to you that our strength will not waver to fulfill your teachings with honor. Comrade Lenin's legacy is to use all our strength to promote the union of peasants and workers and to secure and expand the union of the republics. We swear to you, Comrade Lenin, that we will honorably fulfill your teachings.
As Lenin lay in state, the Soviet state was a developing country. The revolution which the Bolsheviks had expected in the industrialized countries of Western Europe did not take place. The result was that the most powerful nations on the planet confronted the new Soviet Union as an enemy. Russia was still a land of peasants. The proletariat, in whose name the Bolsheviks established a dictatorship, existed only as a rapidly fading minority. And so thus went the ghost of communism around Red Russia. Christ the Savior Cathedral in central Moscow, a symbol of the city, an imposing building for 10,000 believers, which had been built to commemorate the fire of Moscow and the defeat over Napoleon. The old Russia was destroyed in the 1930s, but what replaced it was built on a shaky foundation. This is where the Palace of the Soviets was to be built. A symbol of Soviet power, it was to be the largest building on the planet. Plans call for its spire to be crowned with a statue of Lenin. But this was scrapped because of the soggy ground surrounding the building. In the mountains of Pamir, climbers scaled the highest peak in the Soviet Union. Their packs contain a heavy burden, a stone figure of Stalin. The summit is renamed Mount Stalin, and it's 360 meters taller than Mount Lenin. This incident is symbolic of Stalin's policies in the mid-1930s, whereas 10 years earlier, memories of Lenin had still been fresh. Modern animation was to promote the party. This campaign was Stalin's idea. The party is to be renewed in the name of the dead Lenin. The message is supposed to be, Lenin is dead, but Leninism lives. The only thing missing is a strong leader who is as widely recognized and respected as Lenin. More than 300,000 new members rushed to join the party. Stalin slyly co-opts the national feeling of solidarity brought forth by Lenin's death. Entire collectives join. Stalin's apparatus creates its own party. The new members are politically inexperienced, who only have a vague notion of what Marxism is. They become the base for Stalin's power structure. The young Soviet state starts to produce its first successes. 3/4 of the Tsar subjects were illiterate. The 5-year plans for culture and education produce impressive statistics. Russian satirists, however, mocked many of the newly literate, claiming that the best they could do was scribble their names. The German communist Clara Zetkin, she was a pioneer in the struggle to liberate Soviet women. Eastern women put away their scarves and joined in the construction of Soviet society. They won political equal rights. Progress was reflected in their election to the top levels of the party.
Was there nothing positive under socialism? I think there were some positive phenomena. For example, the fight for equality between the sexes. Of course, this was not realized in the initial forms of socialism, but there was the struggle to get all levels of society involved in helping lead the country. And not only those with access to money. Those are positive aspects of socialism.
Поэтому думаю, что социализм, связанный с Марксом,
I also think that Marxism contains some positive elements regarding how the state should care for the less fortunate in society. But these were completely misrepresented under Stalinist socialism.
Stalin это был гигантский зигзаг в человеческой истории. Гигантский страшный зигзаг.
Stalin showed how the idea of creating a better world can be abused. Why? The main reason why Stalin, Stalinism, and also, of course, Leninism were historical disasters is because they trampled on freedom.
May 1924, the 13th Party Congress begins, the first one without Lenin. Stalin is confident of victory. Everything is ready to strike a fatal political blow to his main rival, Leon Trotsky. But then Lenin's final testament unexpectedly surfaces. This describes Stalin as vulgar and unqualified for his position. Stalin offers to resign, but this is rejected by the delegates who reason a Stalin loyal to Lenin is better than Trotsky, who was seen as vain and confrontational. With the outcome, Trotsky's fate was sealed. Grigory Zinoviev was the powerful party secretary of Leningrad who became one of Stalin's figureheads. Politically finishing off Trotsky alone would have been too much for Stalin. Zinoviev and Kamenev were rhetorically brilliant, and with Stalin created a troika. This three-man group now ran the country. They were given cover by Bukharin, one of the most popular leaders of the Communist Party. New delegates were carefully chosen from the ranks of Stalin's supporters. They were not to be partial to political debate, but rather were to carry Bolshevik ideas to the countryside. They were trained to operate film projectors. Taking our face to the villages was the Party Congress's solution for winning the support of a skeptical peasantry. As early as 1922, Lenin told Stalin how important film and radio would be for propagating communism. Lenin wrote to Stalin, "Developing radio is a necessity for our propaganda and agitation, especially for those among the masses who can neither read nor write." Lenin saw the electrification of Russia as essential. Electric lamps were soon to light up the cities. Lenin said, "Socialism and electrification will help us create communism." Electrification would transform Russia into a modern industrial state. The power station became the symbol of progress. The poet Gerasimov wrote,
"Beneath the voltage bows glows the happy village. Beneath this Milky Way sings a children's choir. The heart of the peasant is an electric light bulb."
The country's vast natural wealth was the basis for the Bolsheviks' gigantic experiment of industrialization with capitalism. This natural wealth was to generate the money which the Soviet state so desperately needed. Money to buy machines and arms, for rebuilding industry after the wars, and for modernizing facilities which survived the Tsarist era. Wood was another vital source of revenue. Starting in 1922, exports of lumber quadrupled in 4 years. A settlement on the Lena, on the edge of Siberia. Adventurers came here to try their luck. The Soviet state owns unbelievably large gold reserves which were first exploited under the Tsars, which even today still generate some capital. Moscow in the 1920s, the party decides to give the country a breathing spell. Lenin once said, in order to go forward, it is sometimes necessary to go back. Private enterprise such as trading, crafts, and small industry were once again legal. The worthless paper ruble, which neither the workers nor peasants no longer want to work for, is discontinued. The new economic policy, or NEP, also gives the peasants a respite. Some communists see the NEP as a first sign of Bolshevik decline. Stalin justifies the change of course by saying, "We want to clear a path for the rebirth of the country and to secure the union of workers and peasants regardless of the obstacles." Zoya Fyodorovna remembers this so-called Soviet Golden Age as a time when people were just a little better off than previously.
Во время начала НЭПа я была в Москве совсем молоденькой девчонкой, но я уже начала зарабатывать.
I was a young girl in Moscow when the new economic policy began and started to earn my own money. Other people did the same and began to realize there was another way to live.
Магазины за одну ночь превращались в блестящие помещения. Там появлялись продукты.
It seemed as if overnight shops were being transformed into halls in which the windows displayed food, clothing and shoes. It was beautiful to experience. Ordinary people especially enjoyed it.
Конечно, уже были дамы, как и сейчас.
Certainly, before the revolution, there had been a class of women who had jewels and furs, but now everyone began to live more freely, more satisfied, better groomed, and in a more beautiful way. That's exactly how it was. With my first paycheck, I was able to finally buy a skirt and blouse. That's how it was.
December 1925, the 14th Party Congress, hopes of world revolution have faded. Socialism was now threatening to die on the vine, as Stalin put it, or would it simply find a new perspective? Stalin put forward his theory of socialism in one country. He said the poor Soviet Union could build socialism without the help of the outside world. There were many at the Party Congress who opposed this path, but Stalin succeeded in keeping any serious opposition at bay. The founder of the Cheka secret police, Felix Dzerzhinsky, also defended Stalin's economic policies. He died after giving one especially emotional speech. His death unified the old Bolshevik elite for the last time. Stalin regarded Dzerzhinsky as an upstanding Bolshevik, as did Trotsky. Stalin, Trotsky, Kamenev, Bukharin, Kuybyshev, Zinoviev, Rykov, Kalinin, Voroshikov all carried the coffin of their dead comrade. December 1927, the 15th Party Congress draws a line to the opposition being put forward by Trotsky and Zinoviev. Both were expelled from the party, as were 75 other prominent Bolsheviks, including Kamenev, Radek, and Pyatakov. Stalin formed a new troika. He was now supported by the party's economists, Rykov and Bukharin, who backed his efforts to rid the party of so-called leftist deviants. At this point in time, Stalin favored a moderate pace of industrialization and felt that violence was inappropriate to speed it up. He also felt that the villages should be allowed to develop peacefully. Collectives were allowed to develop slowly and voluntarily on a step-by-step basis. This was the party's policy, their intention to move the countryside from an agrarian backwater to a modern industrial state led to the first five-year plan. The main focus of the five-year plan was to develop heavy industry, especially steel production. This would require vast amounts of energy. The center of Soviet mining in the 1920s gave the Kremlin no cause for optimism regarding the country's economic policies. Coal was extracted using mostly outdated methods. Production barely met the demands of industry. The country mined only 3% of the world's coal, a dismal situation given the vast size of the Soviet state. The drilling towers of Ukhta, northern Russia. The search was on across the Soviet Union for the energy of the future, which was oil. The Russians called it black gold. Those who found oil reacted in the same happy manner as did those who previously struck gold. The party demanded that the oil industry be developed faster than other industries. At times it seemed as if nature was listening. From 800 meters inside the earth, oil shot out of the ground so forcefully that it split the wooden drilling towers. From that time on, there was no concerns about the environment in the Soviet Union. In the 20s, small-scale production formed the backbone of Soviet industry, around 80%. Especially in the villages, which were unable to survive without the daily necessities provided by local craftsmen. But Stalin also saw industrialization as part of the battle against the small business class. By eliminating this class, Stalin also hoped to eliminate the bourgeois from Soviet territory. Agricultural production also declined because of a shortage of tools and equipment. December 21st, 1929, the entire Soviet Union celebrates the birthday of the great leader, as Joseph Stalin is now referred to. Top Bolshevik functionaries compete in their efforts to flatter him. They try to outdo each other in their attempts to praise Stalin. Now it's Stalin, the Lenin of our time. It is maintained that Stalin led the Bolsheviks to victory in the October Revolution. Everywhere it can be heard that Stalin is the father of the party and the Soviet state. It was the birth of a cult of personality. A few weeks later, the battle in the villages began. The peasants are ordered to form collectives. For years, the agitators in the party have promised machinery and other wares. In exchange, the countryside is to produce grain for the city and for export. But the peasants remain skeptical. Only around 4 of every 100 farms agrees to join a collective. Even these remain too small and can barely feed the peasant's own family. Stalin justifies collectivization by saying that most farms are too small to even raise chickens. The state is only able to convince some of the peasants to join collective farms. The rest are pressured by force. Urban activists ordered the peasants to join the collectives with no excuses. The old Russian village with its individual land parcels is extinguished. The peasants resist. Grain deliveries drop by 2 million tons. The cities suffer even more than previously. Stalin takes direct action by sending workers, functionaries, and policemen to the countryside to take the grain from the peasants. Stalin wants the grain crisis to be resolved using force. The party blames the suffering on the wealthier peasants known as kulaks, which the party claims are trying to exploit the other peasants. A war of destruction is declared against the kulaks. This affects the most capable elements of the peasant class and is aimed at those who have and are able to produce slightly more than the others. But the state does not only confiscate from the larger landowners, but also from millions of small landowners who first attained land through the revolution. 12-year-old Pavlik Morozov denounces his own father, who allegedly had helped the kulaks. The father is sentenced, while Pavlik is celebrated as a hero. 2 years later, he is killed by the peasants of his village. Dekulakization is the word which dominates the countryside. Hundreds of thousands of peasants are sent to Siberia under the watchful eyes of the military and the secret police, now known as the OGPU. The functionaries mock them with cries of "off to Siberia to watch after the polar bears." The Stalinist apparatus of terror emerges during collectivization and is always seeking new victims among the peasantry. The liquidation of the kulaks becomes a war against the villages, which make up 4/5 of the population. The peasants desperately try to defend themselves. There are revolts, barns and stalls on the collectives come under siege. Half of all the horses and cattle are slaughtered. Hardly any animals are left for plowing. There is no meat for the cities. Peasants burn barns containing grain stocks. The peasants are declared to be enemies of the Soviet state. A collective activist was murdered in this village. Her funeral became a signal for violence against the so-called kulaks. Banners read, "We demand the deportation of kulaks from our region." This revolution from above, as Stalin described collectivization, remains controversial until the present day. Yet, industrialization would have been impossible without such drastic changes. Yet Stalin's methods only further damage the country.
Today, one asks the question, was there an alternative to reforming Soviet agriculture than the path taken by Stalin? The answer has to be yes, naturally. But we never had the experience enjoyed by much of the rest of the world of large farms or farming co-ops, which were set up on a voluntary basis and with at least partial support from the state. Stalin decided to force everyone into collectives, and in doing so pushed Soviet farming back into the serfdom era of the 19th century. The collective was actually a 20th century version of serfdom. Stalin's collectivization called for the destruction of the most able, professional, and hardest-working elements of the peasantry. For decades, this damaged the very heart of the peasantry, which has yet to recover. Up until the present, we've had to buy wheat and other grains from Canada, the United States, and other countries. This shows that agriculture never became self-supporting because Stalin replaced the peasantry with slavery.
The results of collectivization were devastating. It took Soviet agriculture 7 years to return to 1929 production levels. Stalin's revolution from above changed Russia more than did 1,000 years of Tsarist policies. The battle against religion was also intensified. This was organized by the Union of the Fighting Godless, led by a close associate of Stalin's. In 1935, the organization had more than 5 million atheist warriors. The state wanted to drive the church from the villages. The Bolsheviks reasoned it would be easier to force the peasantry into collectives if the economic, social, and cultural roots of the village were destroyed. Even the atheist movement had a 5-year plan. Their stated goal was to eliminate God by 1937 and started doing so by destroying his houses of worship. Then the symbol of the new faith was raised. For its part, the church did not mince words. After the revolution, the Patriarch of Moscow said, "Socialism is the religion of pigs." The young intelligentsia was especially enthusiastic about the war on the church. They sang a popular song of the time.
Out with the monks, the rabbis, the popes. In heaven we're cleaning out the barn stalls of God.
Collectivization was followed by industrialization. The summer of 1930, young communists register all over the Soviet Union to help build the country. The first 5-year plan must be made a reality. Magnitogorsk, or the Mountain of Magnets. People had mined iron ore here since the 18th century. A huge iron mining complex was to rise here out of nothing. The plan is ambitious. The iron ore deposits are some of the richest in the world. Coal for the new city is to be brought in from 2,500 kilometers to the east. Enthusiastic young people set out to fulfill the bold plan. They are joined by peasants displaced by collectivization. "200,000 people will later live in a model socialist city. Railways and dams are built first, followed by housing. Plans for the steelworks come from America and include blast furnaces, smelters, and cupola furnaces. The first peasants have a hard time adjusting to the unfamiliar machinery and factory work. They are also prone to alcoholism. Signs warn against operating the machinery while drinking. Foreign engineers and specialists arrive to act as foremen, advisors, and managers. One of them is an American student. In 1933, he reported, "A 250,000 people, communists, kulaks, foreigners, Tatars, saboteurs, and masses of blue-eyed Russian peasants create the largest industrial complex for steel in Europe, right here in the middle of the inhospitable steppes of the Urals. Men freeze, starve, suffer, but the construction work proceeds without regard for the individual in a massive scale of heroism seldom seen in human history." The success of the project is celebrated as a socialist victory and is described as Stalin's miracle. The unusual mixture of enthusiasm and disregard for human life helped further Stalin's project of socialism in one country, but no one bothered to count the victims. Another bold aspect of the five-year plan was the electrification of the railroads. This was vital to establishing a network between the industrial centers of the far-flung country, which were often thousands of kilometers from each other. Use of electricity jumps. The Dnieper River was dammed. The results were rapid. The power plant generated more than 500,000 kilowatts of energy in 1939. Coal mines were modernized and expanded. Demand for coal doubled within the span of a few years. Modern methods were also used for extracting gold. The enormous income this generated helped finance industrialization. All these successes seduced Stalin into planning ever grander and unrealistic projects to be accomplished in ever shorter periods of time. The number of industrial accidents grew rapidly, basic needs were catastrophic, and foodstuffs were rationed. Managers protested in vain. They attempted in desperation to avoid directives from Moscow, but the party struck back. Economic experts, most of whom came from a bourgeois background, were branded as deviants and saboteurs. They were prosecuted in a series of public show trials. The most important of these cases was the trial in 1930 of the so-called Industry Party. State prosecutor Vyshinsky filed the charges against 8 high-level technical specialists and economic professors.
Верховного суда Союза Советских Социалистических Республик объявляется открытым.
That case before us concerns the counter-revolutionary organization from the Union of Engineers, the so-called Industry Party. Over the last 2 years, the unstinting work of OGPU intelligence agents has uncovered a series of deviant organizations in many industrial sectors. Deviant elements have been at work in industries concerned with transportation, arms, textiles, shipbuilding, chemicals, gold, oil, as well as other industries. Defendant Ramzin, you have heard the charges. Do you accept the charge of guilty? Yes, I admit my guilt.
Pre-trial interrogations usually broke the will of those charged with such crimes. Torture, threats, and threats against family members were all part of the secret police's arsenal. Everyone admitted being guilty. Instead of defending themselves, they prosecuted themselves.
The goal of the deviant work of the Industry Party, with the help of the French government and white emigrants, trigger an intervention which would topple the Soviet, was not only treason against the Soviet government, but also treason against the motherland. Without the interference of deviant groups and counter-revolutionaries, there would have been far fewer economic problems, and the tempo of socialist construction would have been much faster. Cooperation with the French General Staff to trigger intervention was a basic tactic of the Industry Party. This was the crooked path laid out by counter-revolutionary engineers. Soviet power managed to prevent it from proceeding.
На обратном пути из Америки, это было в первой половине июля, я встретился с Коноваловым. Он сказал мне, что то положение, в которое...
I met Konovalov after I returned from America. He described the situation in the USSR as follows. Low money reserves, a bad harvest in 1928, food shortages across the country, long queues outside of shops, and inner party struggles between various factions. All of this generated hope that the right time for overthrowing the government was rapidly approaching. I have provided a fully detailed confession. My only chance now lies with the proletarian court of justice.
Humiliation followed self-denunciation.
One more thing, Your Honor. When deciding my punishment, you should know that I give you my word that I will dedicate the rest of my life and all my technical knowledge and my love of work to atone for my guilt.
Professor Ramsin went one step further. He praised the state prosecutor and the leader of the party.
As this year ends, and I say this with total conviction, we must shamefully recognize that the political spirit, the revolutionary conscience of the proletarian masses and their leader have found the proper path, unlike those many experts who supported us and whom we supported. Nonetheless, the past difficult and complicated years of socialist construction have brought forward new power, new strength, and colossal possibilities. Despite all the tireless and damaging work of the counter-revolutionaries and their organizations, we were unable to put a stop to the 5-year plan. Allow me to declare to the people that if my life is spared, I will dedicate the rest of my life to work, if given the chance.
But there was no mercy. The court's verdicts were brutal and direct.
Kalinikov Ivan Andreevich, according to paragraphs 58.3, 58.4, 58.6, 58.11 of the sentencing laws of the USSR, you are sentenced to the highest punishment provided in the defense of socialism: execution by firing squad. The property of the accused is to be confiscated.
5 of the 8 defendants were sentenced to death. 3 others received long jail terms. Later, the death sentences were reduced to 10-year jail terms. The state and the party needed the knowledge of these experts. The fate of the main defendant, Professor Ramzin, was especially grotesque. He continued to lecture under the supervision of the secret police and in 1943 won the Stalin Prize for his scientific inventions. The dispute over the so-called Stalin miracles and the vast loss of life they extracted broke out after the breakdown of the Soviet economy.
Нужна была индустриализация не такой ценой.
Industrialization was necessary, but not at this price. Industrialization was basically carried out at the cost of the peasantry. The peasantry was completely ruined. Hundreds of thousands of peasants were exiled to the Urals to build hydroelectric plants, to build the Volga-Don Canal, the White Sea-Baltic Sea Canal, or to other building sites. The village was ground down to almost nothing. It was a massive stripping away of peasant life. There was no investment for agriculture. Villages were abandoned. Everything was pumped out of them to create massive factories. It should be noted that most of these new factories manufactured arms and munitions to build up the country's military power, to build tanks, planes, and ships. In comparison, light industry was almost completely ignored. Since that time, there has been an imbalance. Heavy industry was allowed to develop rapidly, while light industry, to produce consumer goods for the people, always fell behind. This was seen almost as a law. People learned to get by on what was available. Stalin said we were not to follow Western lifestyles. People had little and were expected to be happy because they were building a communist society. We paid an extremely high price for industrialization.
Поэтому индустриализация далась огромной ценой.
January 1934, the development of the country made a violent lurch forward. Stalin, leading delegates of the 17th Party Congress, an apt symbol. Everything is prepared for the Party Congress of the Victors, as it was called, the only victor being Stalin. However, there were problems beneath the surface. Rapid collectivization led to a famine which killed 6 million people. Falling wages and shortages cast a dark shadow over the glowing picture of Stalin's triumph. Sobered by the industrialization experience, there is growing opposition in the party to the General Secretary. Their goal? Removing Stalin from power. There is no criticism in the speeches. They are full of praise for the party and its leader. Only Marshal Tukhachevsky withholds praise. Stalin will never forgive him. Others, such as the senior functionary Radek, confess to Stalin and ask him to forgive their previous opposition to him. Heroes of the Civil War continue to be honored, such as General Blücher, but the steely and brilliant Stalin, as he likes to be described, cannot abide others being praised alongside of him. Most delegates are happy and proud of what has been achieved. Day and night, thousands of people praised the man who gave them back a feeling of national self-confidence, who showed the people they were capable of accomplishing great deeds when they stuck together and were diligent, obedient, and disciplined. An obsession with the future was widespread and produced ominous results. Delegates from across the Soviet Union were also part of rituals praising Stalin. They presented the first successes of industrialization. Stalin received gifts, trophies of their production. Stalin's most important goals are to strengthen the army and to face down Bolshevism's enemies. In a joking mood, Stalin takes aims at his functionaries. At the summit of all this praise, Stalin receives a reality check. In the election of the Central Committee, Stalin achieves the worst result, 270 votes against him. In contrast, Leningrad's well-liked General Secretary, Sergei Kirov, receives only 3 votes against him. The best result by far. Kirov could become a serious opponent, a final chance to replace the all-powerful Stalin. New tanks, a demonstration of strength. It was a taboo in the Soviet Union to discuss the victims of those times. Now it's enthusiastically debated.
Иногда задают вопрос, оправданы ли были жертвы?
Sometimes the question arises, was it necessary to sacrifice so many people to achieve collectivization and industrialization? Some older people say, how could we have moved this backward country to an industrialized state and to a great power if we had considered what the rest of the world thought? Maybe the victims were simply necessary. To this, I say no and no again. No, no, no. The sacrifices were in vain. In vain, in the sense that a civilized society does not make its way forward on the bones of millions of people. For this there is no justification, because the highest value on this planet should be that of human life, in whose name were millions of people destroyed. Today, I have to say that certain Bolsheviks, even when they wanted a totalitarian society such as Bukharin, a well-known Bolshevik and comrade of Lenin's, who believed that socialism must be built gradually, that agriculture must be changed slowly, that industrialization can only be carried out step by step. And even if Bukharin was not always right, his view in this regard was more correct than Stalin's. It's important that socialism does not become a means to its own end, that ignores the importance of human life. For Stalin, the end was everything, and the people were nothing.
In the inhospitable regions of Siberia, surveyors worked in the Arctic cold. Here, a new railway line was being laid out, the Baikal-Amur-Magistrala, or BAM for short. It is supposed to link Lake Baikal in southern Siberia with the distant Pacific Ocean, a legendary project which is still unfinished. However, other important rail lines began operating in the 1930s, such as the Kuznik-Ural Railway, which shipped coal from Siberia to the steel center at Magnitogorsk. After setbacks at the beginning of the five-year plans, long distances were soon overcome by the railways. After so many successes, Stalin and his circle allowed themselves to be showered with gifts from all parts of the country. For example, coats from the Far East, which Stalin and his friends wore in public. The leader of the Soviet Federation assumed the pose of Father of the Peoples of the Soviet Union, a folkloric comedy in which Stalin's inner circle played along. Lenin advertises for the National Lottery, an image that few Bolsheviks could have imagined during Lenin's lifetime. The Soviet state needed every kopeck it could get to help develop the country. An official gambling campaign sweeps across the land. A cartoon from the Tsarist era shows capitalists using lotteries to steal money out of the pockets of the people. Gambling now helped build socialism. State bonds for large-scale industrial projects. Everyone is urged to help the state by buying such bonds, either voluntarily or through the collective. Aside from the money, there's also a beneficial side effect for the state. Citizens identify with efforts to develop the country into an industrial power. Construction is everywhere, including Moscow. In the early 1930s, 4 times as many people live in the city as did before the revolution. The city requires an underground mass transit system. Ground on the project is broken in 1931. The metro becomes a legendary symbol for socialist progress and a source of pride. The motto of the metro is walk to the left, stand to the right. $70,000 workers are involved with this important state project. The first segment opens on March 14, 1935, and is 12 kilometers long. The metro stations are designed by artists. Stalin arrives to present the project to the Soviet people. He praises it as a triumph of Soviet technology, a pioneering work of modernity, and of course he also mentions that it is a victory for socialism. There is also praise and applause for the men who oversaw the project, Khrushchev and Kaganovich. Stalin brilliantly orchestrates the scene. The first passengers are delegates to the 7th Soviet Congress. German writer Bertolt Brecht is impressed.
And all that which was built in a single year, and built with more workers than any railway, and no railway ever had so many owners.
Three giant car factories are rapidly built. The first cars built in the USSR roll off the assembly line. Although the designs come from Ford, the workers are proud and patriotically describe the vehicles as 100% Soviet. Even then, they want to rival and surpass the United States. From the Molotov plant in Nizhny Novgorod, the cars are driven to Moscow to be shown to the party leadership. 210,000 kilometers of roads need to be built, but only 30,000 kilometers are paved. Comrade Stalin says that is far too little for a country the size of the Soviet Union. Luxury goods, which were once dismissed as capitalistic, are now introduced to the Soviet Union. Stalin orders luxury cars to be built at the Stalin Motor Works in Moscow. According to the second five-year plan, 10,000 are to be produced for the party leadership. The luxury cars are meant to represent the strength and prosperity of Soviet power. Stalin orders punishment for functionaries who reject their privileges. This would be seen as violating party ethics and would undermine party discipline. Stalin sets a good example. The people of the working class have other problems. A minor settlement from the year 1934. Half a generation after the revolution, and workers are still living under miserable conditions. The state tries to turn need into a virtue. The private sphere of the individual is urged to make way for a public life of the collective. This includes even the most basic human needs. Good Day, Comrade Miner, is the name of this film. It provides a unique insight into the life of the Russian proletariat in the mid-1930s. The Russians refer to this way of living as kommunalka. Several families live together in close quarters. They are damned to be together. The party calls for raising a common consciousness. But real life presents another picture. Chalk marks delineate property lines. Cabinets and blankets separate sleeping areas. Humans are not birds that can simply soar to the heights of socialism. The years rush by as the country tries to develop. With many victims and great suffering, a backward land is transformed into a slightly less backward country. Yet many people who lived through them see it as a great period. The first tractors are driven to the fields, yet industry is not yet producing enough, and the victory which is being celebrated everywhere appears threadbare. And despite Stalin, there is much that is new, especially for the youth. Propaganda films from this time show ideal collective farms where everyone works enthusiastically. After so much suffering, the desire for normality is great despite politics. There is some noticeable progress, especially in the Asian parts of the Soviet Union, which arouses hopes that one can move ahead if one works hard enough. Stalin is transformed into a demigod during these years. He gets close to the people only during his rare photo opportunities. Stalin says,
"The backward are doomed. And we do not want to be doomed, definitely not. We are 50 to 100 years behind the developed countries and we must close the gap within 10 years' time. Either we do it or we will be crushed."
Today we know they did not succeed in closing the gap, and Stalin himself did the crushing. The Black Swan in Peter Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. Joseph Stalin was almost always in the audience when this ballet was performed at the Bolshoi Theater. He seemed to love the music and the dancing in Swan Lake above all else. When the curtain fell, he would return to the Kremlin and get back to work. On many nights, he had a literally murderous workload in front of him, often working until daybreak. Death warrants lay on his desk. Often he personally knew the condemned. They were his old comrades. His record for signing execution orders was 3,000 in a single night.
When one reads Stalin's documents, and I've studied his entire personal archive, one is surprised. Human life meant nothing to him. It was just a dry statistic. He was an emotionless person who believed that revolution and progress could not be accomplished without terror and violence. For him, violence was a universal means and method for developing the state.
Государства.
The docks on the Moscow-Volga Canal, a grand Stalinist project completed in 1937. A product of slave labor, just like many others in the Soviet state, built quickly and on the lives of millions of prisoners forced to work in the worst conditions. The victories of Stalinist socialism, colored plaques recall the great industrial works, the collectivization of agriculture, and the long canals which stretch for thousands of kilometers. Work on the Moscow-Volga Canal has been ongoing since 1933 without consideration for the forced laborers, even in the freezing cold. This project was organized by the political police. The head of the camp speaks to his prisoners.
Your attention for a moment, please. On behalf of the government and the party, and at the initiative of our dear leader, Comrade Stalin, we are now going to begin the construction of the biggest canal in the world, which shall link Moscow with the Volga. You, citizens, are here as lawbreakers, but we regard you as people who will participate in fulfilling the biggest government project in the world.
Hunger and hard labor in freezing temperatures kill untold thousands. Deported peasants, priests, intellectuals, and criminals. This human material comes from all over the Soviet Union. The most progressive penal system in the world is planned in advance. The writer Maxim Gorky wrote, "On the biggest building site in our country, we are transforming social misfits into honest workers." However, the reality is different from the beginning. The dispossessed prisoners are exploited by a power which has no regard for them, and yet record work quotas are still expected. A dam threatens to burst. Unrealistic plans lead to shoddy work. The number of work accidents is extremely high. Setbacks are inevitable. On the next day, these people will once again be herded back to work. Who does not pull his weight has his rations reduced, yet the full ration is still a hunger ration. Prisoners have a choice, either to work to death or to starve to death. There is a grim saying around the camps, better half through hunger than all through work. A power apparatus of terror is built. The camp system brought Stalin a whole army of guards who are trained by the military. The political police becomes a powerful institution which stands alongside and eventually above the party. The political police have existed since the beginning of Bolshevik rule. A few weeks after the October Revolution, in December of 1917, the Bolsheviks established the Cheka, or the All-Russian Special Commission to Combat Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. The Cheka achieves infamy as a sentry of the revolution and terror of the bourgeoisie. The organization existed until the end of Soviet rule under a variety of names: GPU, OGPU, NKVD, MGB, and KGB. The Cheka used barbaric methods. Even in 1918, it executed thousands of people. The legendary head of the Cheka is Felix Dzerzhinsky, a Polish aristocrat and old Bolshevik, the organizer of the Red Terror. Iron Felix establishes a name for himself as incorruptible, but also as a tough and gray revolutionary policeman. Under his command, prisons and detention camps soon open. Zoya Fyodorovna remembers.
Many young people used to meet at our place. We freely discussed everything. But it was a flat with multiple tenants, a communal apartment. There were many people around who spied for the police. My brother was sentenced to 10 years at the Solovki camp. I was allowed to visit him before he went to the camp, but he had to shout to me from behind the wire fence among a crowd of people. On one side were the prisoners, on the other their relatives, who had gathered to bid them farewell before they left for the camp. When I asked him why he had been arrested, he replied, "Because of my pure belief in Leninism."
За что тебя арестовали? Потому что я не знала. Он сказал, за чистоту ленинских убеждений.
A prison ship lands on Solovki, an island on the White Sea in northern Russia. During Tsarist times, it was a place of exile for disgraced aristocrats. The island's monastery was closed in 1921. A year later, the political police opened a forced labor camp. This is where the enemies of the Soviet Union were brought to. White officers, rebellious red sailors, anarchists, socialists, social democrats, officials of the old regime, priests, engineers, black marketeers, speculators, and also criminals. Solovki is the mother of all prison camps in the Soviet Union, the first cell in the massive Gulag archipelago. The prisoner population is still relatively small. At most, 30,000 Soviet citizens sit in this camp, but even then, one could be sent to such a place at short notice.
I
had a well-trained memory because I was a stenographer. I came home and wrote out an entire conversation and put the paper inside a book. Then I forgot about it, although I may have shown it to my mother. But the paper was discovered. These notes I had written about my brother. It dealt not only with his views, but also with the fact that he had already been tortured in 1929. Sometimes he was placed under a very strong lamp. Other times he was taken somewhere as if he were about to be shot. Because of these notes, I spent 3 years in a prison camp.
The full extent of the miserable living and work conditions cannot be conveyed in these pictures. Every second prisoner perished during their ordeal. It was here in Solovki that the whole perfidious camp system with its punishment and reward system was created, from a prisoner. Another prisoner attempted to escape by appealing to the party in the naive hope that the leadership would improve the conditions inside the camp. He wrote,
"To the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the USSR. We are prisoners who were released from the Solovki prison camp because of illness. We arrived in good health and full of energy. We now leave as invalids, physically and morally crippled and broken. In the names of the thousands of people who are imprisoned there, we appeal to the leadership of the Soviet state to end the misery which reigns there. People are dropping like flies. Their deaths are painful. Most importantly, the entire burden of violence, despotism and injustice which rules over Solovki is borne on the shoulders of the workers and peasants. For now, counter-revolutionaries and conmen live well there because they have money. And alongside them, because of the tyranny of the GPU guards, workers and peasants are dying because they don't have bribe money as they work 14 to 16 hours a day in the cold. And then there's the hunger. The guards make us stand barefoot in the night cold when there's frost and it's only 30 degrees. The investigative commission, which comes only once a year, has a slight idea of the atrocities there. Just one example of thousands. They forced us to eat our own excrement."
It was under such conditions that the great buildings of communism were created in the 1930s. Another example is the canal between the Baltic Sea and the White Sea, which was built in just 19 months. The construction was overseen by Sergei Kirov, the party secretary for Leningrad. Of the 300,000 workers who toiled here, every third one died. The canal was named for Stalin. Few boats would follow the ships who made the first journeys through the canal. The Stalin Canal was a botched construction. Too flat, and in any case, half of the year it is under ice. Alexander Solzhenitsyn issued this judgment: to choose in haste is to be born blind. Iron ore in Magnitogorsk, in the Urals, or in Magadan, north of the Arctic Circle. Trains in the Soviet Far East. Oil and coal in Siberia or in the desert steppes of Kazakhstan. Everywhere there was a mass army of slave laborers. The camps are constantly being filled, not just with political prisoners. Some just have bad luck.
I'm an old man. I know this time well. I lived through it myself. People really did have fear and were afraid to speak about anything which reflected badly on the leadership. They did not dare make critical remarks about the Central Committee, the Politburo, and especially Stalin. Every careless word could end in tragedy. On our collective farm, the following once happened. A young man accidentally caused a bust of Stalin to fall and smash. Everyone was silent, deathly quiet. 2 days later, this man disappeared. He was not seen again. He was accused of creating the accident on purpose to insult the leader. That was the kind of fear surrounding Stalin. But a society that is created out of fear cannot be stable. When the fear disappears, so does the society. And that is exactly what happened to our society, the one built by Stalin.
Early 1937, the Moscow-Volga Canal is almost completed. This 128-kilometer-long waterway will link Moscow to the industrial centers on the Volga. The canal is also aimed at improving water supplies to the capital and regulating the river system around Moscow. Stalin appears in person to inspect the completion of this massive project. At Stalin's side is Nikolai Yezhov, the notorious chief of the NKVD political police. This period of the terror is named after him. In Russian, it is known as Yezhovchina. At the official opening in July 1937, 129 officials are awarded medals. The NKVD and the Construction Collective are paid gratitude. The numerous people who died during the project are not mentioned. Alone in the years between 1936 and 1938, the mass terror cost the lives of 1.3 million people. All the progress achieved in the Soviet Union was built on such barbarism. Today, there are only traces of most of the camps. Although the camps continued to exist well into the 1950s when they were shut down, one camp at a time. Composer Olga Bergholz wrote a song about one such camp.
No, our poor books do not remind us of the beggar's bag. You'll know that we led bland and difficult lives. Life was raw and bitter. We did not dare be honest when we were interrogated, shaking and angry. We betrayed our own when forced to speak. Oh, the scandal of these deep wounds which we not only suffered there, the tragedy of the people who perished in the mines of Kolyma.
An August night in the year 1935, the miner Alexei Stakhanov extracts 14 times more coal in one shift than the normal quota requires. With this record accomplishment, the Stakhanov movement is born. The party promoted this event against the advice of coal industry experts. In front of the camera, Stakhanov's coal workers were beaming, but in reality, they hated him and his imitators. They knew their quotas would soon be raised and that even more work would be demanded of them. Stakhanov was bombarded with awards and honors. He was allowed to meet with Stalin in the Kremlin.
Previously, there were 23 of us miners. Now there are just 10. Naturally, you think this is more difficult, but there are no problems. Quite the opposite. It's actually a relief, a big relief. What do we receive for this work? Before, my wage was 450 rubles, but now we and other miners earn up to 2,000 rubles.
The hero of labor receives his own automobile. This is aimed at inspiring other workers. Everywhere, normal production quotas are raised. Stalin holds a speech against stagnation. Production records are reportedly broken all over the Soviet Union. Alexei Stakhanov is no longer an ordinary worker. He travels the country as a propagandist and becomes a delegate to the Supreme Soviet. An audience with the great leader Stalin, the best female workers from a rhubarb collective. The best worker movement is the high point of Stalin's industrialization program, but economically it is a flop. Work record holders often disrupted the pace of production. The triumphant return of the rhubarb workers who visited Stalin, at least according to this propaganda film. In reality, they were hated by their fellow workers for disrupting pay scales. A gift from the party. For many years, the gift was a gramophone with recordings of Stalin's speeches, a gift which hardly motivated the workers. Other rewards, such as red banners, only brought symbolic successes. None of these methods could solve the structural problems of the Soviet economy. It was simply not enough and poorly done. The storm of the Taiga Collective challenges the Red Dawn Collective. The prize is the honorary Red Banner from the construction of the BAM Railway, which is still in the possession of the champions, Red Dawn. The gladiators were the prisoners of the Baikal-Amur Magistral Railway. Works contests were events held in the camps for flags, pennants, and records. If rewards failed, there was always punishment. A labor camp instead of a gramophone. For those who missed work because of drinking or who made mistakes on the job, they might find themselves competing for the title of Hero of Labor while trying to subsist on hunger rations. Individuals were selected from the masses. The collective counted for little. A Soviet sculptor is to make a statue of this young woman. She should be a steely inspiration for other young women. As socialist realism dictates, she is a natural yet heroic example of the ideal worker. Thereby, even average people can see how grateful they should be to live in a socialist paradise. Soon there are more heroes of labor made out of stone and steel than out of flesh and blood. Production continues to lag far behind Western nations. A subotnik is named for the Russian word for Saturday, sabota. A subotnik is a person who works for nothing on a voluntary basis. Even Lenin praised them as great figures of inspiration for others. However, the effectiveness of these predecessors of the Stakhanov movement is dubious. The poor production levels could be blamed on the short periods of time workers were allowed to rest and recover from working. It was usually nothing more than well-intentioned formulations thought up by economic functionaries and intellectuals. It was mostly for party officials such as Khrushchev and Kaganovich who briefly promoted the subotniks. Well-intentioned schemes were also applied to raising children. In 1921, there were 4.5 million children wandering across the country because of the Civil War. A committee for the improvement of children's lives is set up to establish schools and workshops. Educational reformers hope to create new people. Their methods of proletarian education range from anti-authoritarian to totalitarian. Stalin's poetic remarks on education: teachers must tend to these children as a gardener would tend to his favorite fruit tree. The dispute among educators as to the best method for teaching and raising children has ended in the early 1930s, when the party opts for a hard line. Drills, commands, and mass discipline is what is required. This is the first step towards developing a military society. Nonconformists are quickly dealt with. Stalin begins the Great Purge, a word which fails to convey the destruction of millions of lives.
Мне кажется, что большой террор прежде всего обеспечивает.
It appears to me that Stalin's aim with the Great Terror was to eliminate any potential opposition to his rule. I repeat, potential opposition, and not those who posed a real threat to him. By 1937, practically no one would think about opposing him. Stalin was at the zenith of his power. Everyone answered to him. He was an absolute dictator with absolute power. But Stalin had the feeling that not all of his methods were being accepted. He understood that there were many who could not reconcile themselves to a brutally totalitarian state, including the old Bolsheviks and others, but especially the intelligentsia. Stalin could not forgive them for opposing the system, even if it was just in their thoughts. And so Stalin resorted to the violent mass terror which affected millions upon millions of people. It was a level of brutality that was unknown in history until that point. Blood flowed like rivers. The wheel of violence began to turn. As the destruction began, people inside the Stalinist system felt compelled to find and reveal enemies of the state. This arbitrary tyranny moved like an avalanche which no one could stop.
Которое остановить было непросто.
Leningrad, December 1934. Massive demonstrations all over the city. The party secretary of Leningrad, Sergei Kirov, has been murdered. Up until the present day, the circumstances surrounding his death remain unclear. Banners carried the message, "Destroy the enemies of the state." Kirov's murder was a boost for Stalin. Sergei Kirov had long been an ally of Stalin's, but many had also seen in him the best hope for the future of the party and an end to the terror, the persecution, and injustice. Kirov was the only person who could have replaced Stalin. Stalin rushed to Leningrad. He personally led the investigation into Kirov's murder. Sergei Kirov was given a state funeral. Stalin kept vigil at the coffin of the man he described as his friend. But there were already rumors that the NKVD, the secret police, had killed Kirov on orders from Stalin. Kirov's murder led to the historically unprecedented Great Purge. The entire Soviet leadership participated in the days-long ceremony surrounding Kirov's funeral. The killing led to a massive witch hunt for the murderers. The results of the investigative commission provided both the alleged guilty parties and their primary goal, the overthrow of the Soviet government. Stalin blamed the killing on one of his former rivals, Leon Trotsky. Stalin's one-time challenger was living in exile in Mexico. Trotsky's articles condemning Stalin were published in newspapers around the globe, yet Trotsky's influence inside the Soviet Union was minimal. Cartoons portrayed Trotsky as an attack dog for the Gestapo. Others showed the Jewish Trotsky painted with a swastika. To be branded a Trotskyist in the Soviet Union was the equivalent of a death sentence. Stalin began to eliminate the Bolshevik old guard, including friends with whom he had ruled the country just a few years before. The Moscow show trial cloaked the murders in a legal context. Among those in the dock was Grigory Zinoviev, the old Bolshevik and comrade of Lenin's, who was also the head of the Comintern, or Communist International. In 1936, he was sentenced and executed by firing squad. Lev Kamenev, an old Bolshevik who had been with Lenin in exile. A chief editor of Pravda, in 1936 he was sentenced and executed. The trials were accompanied by rabid denunciations of Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, the Gestapo. No means were spared to disgrace the condemned. Grigory Zinoviev was described as a cunning bandit. Anti-Semitism was also a part of this campaign of defamation. A year and a half later, Stalin eliminated another former comrade, Nikolai Bukharin, the prominent Marxist theorist whom Lenin once described as the favorite of the party. Stalin and Bukharin had worked together against Trotsky. And later against Zinoviev and Kamenev, here with Stalin on Red Square. The relationship with Stalin began to break down at the end of the 1920s, but Bukharin was given a reprieve for several more years. He was arrested in 1937. The trial of Nikolai Bukharin and 20 others began in March of 1938. As in the other show trials, the prosecution was led by Vyshinsky, who represented the state, and Stalin. This trial, which shocked the world, was extensively filmed. Yet the accused, Bukharin, is nowhere to be seen in any of the pictures. In contrast, all of State Prosecutor Vyshinsky's tirades have been recorded.
Exactly 1 year ago, Comrade Stalin analyzed deficiencies in our work and arrived at the conclusion that the Trotskyite hypocrites must be liquidated. This direction he outlined in an article he wrote in which he stated 2 words on the deviants, saboteurs, spies and others: Trotskyites and Bukharinites. Your Honor, this whole right-wing Trotskyite bloc, whose leadership is now in the dock, is not a political party. It is not a political movement. This bloc has no ideological content, nothing intellectual, as was the case with earlier members of this clique. Now it has sunk into the fetid ground of underground spies.
Давным-давно исчезла, истлела в смрадном, отвратительном шпионском подполье. Это та же 5-я колонна, это тот же ПУОМ, это тот же Ку-Клукс-Клан. В подлинном смысле это...
This is a 5th column, a Ku Klux Klan, which has opened the door to the enemy, who is a sniper from a secret perch, who wants to help invading enemies conquer our villages and cities, who wants to contribute to the defeat of their own country. It is clear that these so-called masters must be mercilessly crushed and destroyed. Some of the accused, as you remember, especially Bukharin, did not even make an attempt to put a good face on a bad situation. Bukharin likes it, how should I put this, to describe himself as a theorist, a Marxist, in fact, an orthodox Marxist. Bukharin shamelessly lied back in 1918 when he broke with left-wing communists. Bukharin is also telling now lies before the court. Bukharin knew of the plan to arrest Lenin, Stalin and Sverdlov, and who knew of such a plan would also have carried it out. Who is prepared to use force is also prepared to commit murder. The plot has been uncovered. The mask of treason has been torn from their faces, now and forever. Let the verdict be heard like thunder, like a fresh, purifying thunderstorm of Soviet justice. Our entire country, no matter whether young or old, demand only one thing, that the traitors and spies who wanted to sell out the homeland should be shot like rabid dogs. The masses demand only one thing, to stamp out this accursed vermin.
Раздавите проклятую гадину.
Всем 170-миллионным народом нашей великой социалистической Родины мы, колхозники
We farmers from the collective speak for the 150 million people of our great socialist homeland and want to express our deep thanks to Nikolai Ivanovich Yezhov, the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs and the best comrade of our Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. He was able to uncover and bring to trial a whole band of murderers and provocateurs from the rightist Trotskyite Bukharin groups as well as from a German group and other fascists.
Из группы немецких и других фашистских разведок, ведущие нас от победы к победе, не позволим отдать наших завоеваний.
Bukharin knows the verdict before it is read by the judge Ulrich. In his closing statement, he expresses his loyalty to the party. He tells them,
"Comrades, when you carry the banner of communism onward to victory, you'll know that a bit of my blood will be on it."
The verdict.
It has been proven that in the year 1918, Bukharin and a group of left-wing communists, along with Trotsky and left-wing socialist revolutionaries, organized a plot against the Soviet government with the goal of breaking the Brest Peace Treaty, to arrest and kill Lenin, Stalin and Sverdlov, and to establish a new government. Bukharin Nikolai Ivanovich, Rykov Alexei Ivanovich, Yagura Heinrich Grigorievich are sentenced to the highest punishment, to be executed by firing squad, their entire property to be confiscated.
Товарищи, перед нами стоит великая задача.
Comrades, we have a great task before us. We have to rally even closer to the party of Lenin and of our friend and teacher, Comrade Stalin.
Товарищи, враги хотели нашу...
Comrades, the enemy wants to carve up our Soviet Republic, but we have our NKVD secret police, which is led by Stalin's truest comrade, Nikolai Ivanovich Yezhov.
Николай Иванович Ежов.
Long live our dear friend, the creator of humanity, Comrade Stalin.
Life became grim for the party's top functionaries. At the 17th Party Congress in 1934, 139 men and women were elected to the Central Committee. 3 years later, only 24 of them were still alive. Young functionaries and new Stalin loyalists came to the fore. Two prominent examples: Nikita Khrushchev, born in 1894, son of a worker, a party functionary. In 1939, he was elected to the Politburo. In 1954, Khrushchev would succeed Stalin. Leonid Brezhnev, born in 1906, the son of a worker. He was an agrarian engineer by training. He would later replace Khrushchev. In addition to party functionaries, average citizens were also randomly shot. Here, Stalin approves the executions of 5,440 people by firing squads. Yet he writes on the document, raise the number to 9,000. With a nonchalant stroke of a pencil, he sentences more than 3,000 people to death. And on this scrap of paper, he scrawls a death sentence for 6,000 people. The Soviet dictator himself has never been a soldier, yet he likes to wear a uniform to the parades of the Red Army on Red Square. The army is the pride of the Soviet state, its commanders are widely respected, and most know Stalin personally. Soviet parachutists on maneuvers in 1936. The Red Army developed the concept of modern warfare in cooperation with the German Reichswehr. This cooperation ends when Hitler comes to power in 1933. Nazi Germany threatens to become a deadly enemy of the Soviet Union. This warning was issued by a leading Soviet general, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky.
Напомнить вам, что Германия, германский генеральный штаб
I want to remind you that Germany and the German Army General Staff has sped up the rebuilding of its army. Comrades, it is clear that in the current situation where there are countries between us and Germany which have better ties to Germany than Belgium did in 1914 when it denied German troops an advance. It is clear that German troops, when they want, will find a way to attack our territory.
In June of 1937, Stalin allowed a military court to try, convict, and execute 8 high-ranking officers, including Tukhachevsky. They were accused of plotting Stalin's overthrow with the help of the Germans. After that, almost all top-ranking officers were purged. More staff officers died in the purges than during the Second World War. Only 2 army commanders survived these barbaric waves of elimination. The poet Nadezhda Mandelstam wrote, "The people are quiet and should remain so. Better to close the mouth, eyes, and ears, and to live." Stalin says, "Comrades, we are living better, we are living happier, and living happily leads to better work." The party is now firmly in the control of the former seminarian. His religious upbringing sits deep in his bones. His speeches sound like catechisms.
Comrade Stalin knows he has duties to fulfill for the people. To the workers. To the peasants. To the intelligentsia.
Then Stalin called on the people to morally support the troops, to help steel them for the forthcoming battle in the name of the party, the people, and their leader.
May you be fearless in the battle against the enemy, like Lenin. May you be free from panic, from the slightest panic, when you confront danger on the horizon, or wherever it appears. May you be free from panic, like Lenin. May you confront complex questions by approaching them from different sides, like Lenin. And be truthful and honest, as was Lenin. Sometimes I have to ask myself, how would Stalin behave on television? I have the feeling that he wouldn't be rushing to get on camera. He felt that public appearances should be rare if they're to be mysterious and secretive. Every appearance of the leader should be seen as an event. This was a principle which Stalin kept to. Stalin would sometimes chide someone who praised him too much. For example, no one could write a book about Stalin's childhood. Stalin would say, no one can bring out such a book because it would praise the leader too much. Then it became known and people would talk and write, look how modest Stalin is. Stalin was a brilliant actor. I know everything about Stalin and know that he would stand in front of a large mirror in his hallway and try out different poses. The martial pose, how he had to hold his hand, how he had to walk. It was also revealing how he gave speeches during the party congresses. He spoke with a low voice, which made everyone listen more intensely. The hall would be completely still. It was like people were listening to God speak. Only very seldomly did he raise his voice. Stalin had a slow gait and would make short, tiny steps. And all that seemed extraordinary. The way he moved, his speeches, it always made an impression.
Little is known about Stalin's private life. Occasional hunting trips were the only thing which broke up his outwardly modest existence. He hated luxury in all forms. He preferred simply furnished, Spartan apartments, a garden for the dacha to get some fresh air. The private Stalin was hidden from the public. Hidden away, too, were the photos of his scarred and pockmarked face, which revealed the marred face of the great leader. Yekaterina Svanitsa, Stalin's first wife, died in 1907. It was at her grave that Stalin is said to have cried for the last time. Nadezhda Sergeyevna Alilueva was Stalin's second wife and was 22 years younger. A gymnast, she married Stalin when he served as a minister to Lenin. In the early years, they were able to have something resembling a family life. Here they enjoy a day at Stalin's dacha with Voroshilov and his wife. Later, Stalin only concerned himself with politics. Stalin's cold and brusque manner and his harsh policies greatly affected his sensitive wife. In 1932, she committed suicide. Stalin saw this as a betrayal and refused to attend her funeral. Stalin, here with his daughter Svetlana, who was born in 1925. Stalin and his children are an alarming chapter in the dictator's biography. Stalin, who sent hundreds of thousands from freedom to the camps with a single word, was a bad father. Svetlana distanced herself from him and later lived abroad. The steely father sentenced her boyfriend and her first love to 10 years in prison. The violent-tempered and weak-willed son, Vasily, had a brilliant early career with the Air Force. He was a general by the time he was 24, but the Stalin offspring is, militarily, a complete failure. After Stalin's death, he went to prison and had to leave the military. Even worse was the fate of Yakov, Stalin's elder son from his first marriage. He was a German prisoner of war. Stalin rejected a prisoner swap. Yakov refused to be a traitor and threw himself on the barbed wire at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where a guard shot and killed him. March 10, 1939, the 18th Party Congress, Stalinism in its purest form. Party, state power, the secret police, and the economy have merged into a center of concentration. All of his enemies have been dealt with, and the masses are disciplined and hard-working. This Party Congress revolves entirely around Stalin.
The victorious great party of the Bolsheviks lives. Long live our courageous, powerful, talented people, a people of heroes, a people of creators. Long live our will, our power, our fame, our pride, our love, the flag and hopes of all workers, and long live our dear and wise Stalin.
Товарищи, трудящиеся города Ленина.
Comrades, the workers from the city of Lenin, from the cradle of the proletariat revolution, and from the Leningrad region send the delegates of the 15th Party Congress to the party of Lenin and Stalin and our wise leader, organizer and inspiration of the victory of socialism, Comrade Stalin, we send you a blazing Bolshevik greeting.
Сталину пламенный большевистский привет!
Long live our dear comrade Stalin. Hurrah, comrades!
In the name of all workers from the Ivanova region, we send you the following message. If anyone attempts to destroy our peaceful existence and tries to put his pig snout into our vegetable garden, we are in the position to switch over to equipment and machinery and weapons, and will shoot at all enemies of humanity. The whole land celebrates and laughs. Everyone is happy because we have a good life. We are the children of this great country. Is there another country on the planet where people are not suffering and do not know misery? Where the children are as happy as we are? Everywhere we are happy as never before, with every hour of study and play, because our great Stalin is the best friend of children.
Великий Сталин, нам, ребятам, самый лучший друг.
This gift was made by our mothers, who asked us to present it to Comrade Stalin personally.
There was no discussion, no theoretical minds were questioned. There were only strong hands to clap with. At this party congress, the Bolsheviks referred to themselves as the party of the best, as in where the best sons of the working class and the working peasantry gathered together. It was at this party congress that the Great Terror officially ended, although in reality it did continue. Stalin did hold a speech in which he warned that the Soviet Union was threatened and surrounded by capitalist nations. War was already on the horizon. The Fountain of Friendship at the entrance to the Moscow Exhibition Complex. Female figures wearing the national costumes of the peoples of the USSR. Symbols of unity inside the Soviet state. Stalinist art, socialist realism. The University of Moscow, set up during the final years of the Red Dictator, one of 7 massive Stalinist buildings which continue to dominate the city skyline up until the present day. Monumental building projects like those found in metropolitan America, a combination of skyscraper and cathedral, the Soviet Union emerges as a superpower alongside the United States. But before it does, the country faces the hardest test of survival in its history. August 23, 1939, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flies to Moscow. Following fruitless talks with Britain and France, Stalin wants to end his country's international isolation. He refers to the USSR as an island in a sea of capitalist states. The world holds its breath as Foreign Ministers Molotov and von Ribbentrop conclude a treaty on behalf of their leaders, Stalin and Hitler, who are sworn enemies of each other. Stalin appears relieved at the signing ceremony. He says he wants to forget that in the past the two countries, in his phrase, poured buckets of swill on each other. This non-aggression pact contained a number of secret protocols, including the partition of Poland and the Baltic states. Stalin celebrated this act of German-Soviet friendship with a toast to Hitler, though Stalin would eventually refer to the treaty as a pact with the devil. Stalin told his guests, "I know how much the German people love their leader, so I want to drink to his health." With thick lines, Stalin helped draw spheres of influence. September 1939. Without declaring war, the German Wehrmacht attacks Poland. After 6 weeks, the Polish army capitulates. The German word blitzkrieg enters the languages of all nations. At first, Stalin hesitates to take his piece of the Polish pie. Only once the Germans have surrounded Warsaw does Stalin give the order for the Red Army to enter eastern Poland. Stalin sends Hitler a telegram of congratulations after the Germans take Warsaw. The Wehrmacht and the Red Army meet on the river Bug, the new border of their spheres of influence. Parts of the Polish army fall to the Soviets. Officers are detained at camps inside Russia and Ukraine. Many inside the newly captured territories regard the Red Army as liberators. 2/3 of eastern Poland's populations are Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jews. But the soldiers are accompanied by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Those seen as opponents of the Soviet regime are sent to prison camps or labor camps. Executions by firing squad become routine. Until the early summer of 1941, the German ambassador, Graf Schulenberg, and the Soviet foreign minister, Molotov, sign a series of agreements. These resolve a series of border issues. For a few $1 million, the Germans hand over territory to Stalin. The Soviet Union has bled white through the Great Terror. The people are exhausted. Thousands of desperately needed experts and specialists sit in labor camps. The Red Army is missing the commanders whom Stalin ordered shot. May 1941, a deceptive calm. The People's Commissar for Defense, Marshal Timoshenko, warns of war.
Comrade soldiers, sailors, flyers, commanders, political workers, collective farmers and intelligentsia. I congratulate you on the International Day of the Proletariat, May the 1st. Comrades, this year workers in our country and around the world celebrate this holiday in the shadow of an extraordinarily difficult situation.
At the same time, Stalin is brooding. He is aware of the danger of war, yet he denies it. He ignores his generals' warnings. The people continue to believe Stalin more than the ominous signs of the coming conflict.
There was the following cliché about Stalin. that he was a genius, a leader of people who knew everything and never made mistakes. This was the case before the war, but when people began to sense that Stalin had made an error, that in a few hours the war would start, that was when Stalin's own personal view was, if I don't want it, there will not be a war. He told everyone that war would be prevented, but it was not to be. Stalin became a god on earth. This transformation turned the majority of people into one huge grey amorphic mass in which personalities dissolved, where individual personalities no longer existed. There was the leader and there were the masses. It was a horrible situation. People believed Stalin because they fanatically believed in him, not for truth or reason, but because of a fanatical blind faith. I would go so far as to say that Stalinism was a kind of world religion. Decades have passed since that time, but the after effects of this religion continue to be felt until the present day.
June 22, 1941, the Black Night of the fascist invasion begins. The German Wehrmacht attacks the Soviet Union. On the first day of the war, the Soviet Air Force loses 1,200 aircraft, most of which are destroyed on the ground by the Germans. Stalin orders the military to smash the enemy. This was a completely unrealistic assessment of the situation. Stalin refused to address the Soviet people, a job left up to Molotov. Stalin stayed out of public view. For days he is not to be spoken to. He could not comprehend the devastating losses during the first days of the war. His authority was not supposed to be shaken. German troops were seen by some as liberators of the Soviet yoke, for example, in Lithuania. Yet those who welcomed the Germans would soon come to regret it. The Wehrmacht was followed by troops of the Nazi SS. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were killed in the opening days of the war. Millions of others were taken prisoner. Many were never to be seen again. Stalin's purge of the officer corps led to bitter results on the battlefield. No one was spared. It was total war from the beginning. Finally, on July 3rd, Stalin spoke to the Soviet people.
Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, fighters of the Army and Navy, my friends, I appeal to you. The heinous attack by Hitler's Germany continues. What has fascist Germany achieved by breaking the pact and attacking the USSR? Its troops have achieved an advantageous situation, but politically they have lost, because they have revealed themselves to the world to be bloodthirsty aggressors.
The Soviet power desperately tries to defend itself. Everywhere, volunteers sign up. Jewish Soviet citizens are evacuated from western areas to the east. The Volga Germans are deported from their region because Stalin fears they will cooperate with the Wehrmacht. The history of this deportation is an especially tragic chapter in the Stalinist policies of what the Soviets called the Great Fatherland War. Hundreds of thousands of well-armed NKVD men who were needed on the front instead had to carry out these forced deportations. Within a few months, and with great difficulty, the Soviet regime was able to shift industrial production sites from the west to points further east. 1,500 factories were relocated to the Volga region, the Urals, to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and to other parts of Central Asia. This effort required millions of rail cars. Leningrad's most important munitions plant was transported with great sacrifice across Lake Ladoga. The relocated facilities were integrated with existing factories behind the Volga. Former motor and arms plants from Leningrad and Charkov were merged with Siberian tractor factories to create the huge Tankograd factory, which supplied tanks to the front. In the fall of 1941, the Wehrmacht sent 1 million men to attack the capital. The government and administration left Moscow. Stalin remained in the Kremlin. The Germans stood at the gates of the city. The Soviet leadership marked the 24th anniversary of the October Revolution, which featured a speech by Stalin.
Comrades, soldiers, sailors of the Red Fleet, commanders, political workers, and partisans. People all over Europe who have fallen under the tyranny of Germany see you as their liberators. You have the honor of being part of this liberating mission. Prove that you are worthy of this task. Let our ancestors be an inspiration to you. Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Boyarsky, Alexander Suvorov, Mikhail Kutuzov. Let us do this under the unvanquishable banner of the great Lenin. Destroy the German invaders. Death to the occupiers. Long live our homeland, its freedom and independence. Under the banner of Lenin, forward to victory.
Patriotic films are used to remind the Russians of past victories. Stalin, the military layman, sees himself following in the footsteps of Russian history's great military leaders. On December 6, 1941, Stalin issues the order for a major counteroffensive. The Battle of Moscow gives the German Wehrmacht its first taste of the catastrophe to come. August 1942, Britain's wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill visits Stalin. Churchill, who once called Bolshevism a plague deserving liquidation, is now an ally of the Red Dictator. The economically powerful United States is also an ally in the anti-Hitler coalition. Supplies from the USA help bolster the resistance of the Red Army. Without this help, the Soviets would not have been able to turn back the German attackers so quickly. But the vehicles and weapons from the West also help the British and Americans, as the Red Army bears most of the burden in the war against the Germans. The Soviet regime mobilizes all of the country's resources for the war effort. Leaving one's place of work without permission is considered an act of treason. Those caught doing so must appear before a military tribunal. Workers more or less voluntarily donate portions of their meager wages to the war effort. October 1942, the Soviets marked the 25th anniversary of the revolution. To avoid German air raids, celebrations are held in a Moscow subway station. The German army is in the Caucasus and on the Volga. Since the outbreak of the war, Stalin is the head of government and commander of the armed forces, as well as Secretary General of the Communist Party. As a military commander, he makes grave mistakes. Strategic decisions are made using a globe on his desk. The generals are outraged. The Red Army stumbles from one crisis to the next. Stalin addresses the leaders of the party, the state, and the army.
Comrades, 24 years have gone by since the victorious Great Socialist October Revolution, which marked the beginning of the construction of Soviet society. We stand at the door of the 25th year of Soviet leadership. The war has extremely restricted our peaceful work, and has forced its suspension in some areas. It has also forced us to concentrate all of our energies on the war effort. Behind the lines, the entire country is working for the Red Army and the fleet. The period of peaceful construction has come to an end. The period of fighting the German conqueror has begun. At the start of their attack, the invaders believed they would conquer the Soviet Union in a couple of months, during which they would reach the Urals. It has to be said, the German plan for their blitzkrieg was not a secret. In fact, they made this plan public whenever possible. But facts on the ground have shown the senselessness and recklessness of this plan. It can now be said this foolish plan has failed.
In the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht launches their last major offensive in the east. The goal of the offensive, led by the tanks of the 6th Army, is to capture Stalin's namesake city, Stalingrad. The battle for Stalingrad is long and bitter and goes on for 6 months. Afterwards, the industrial city on the Volga is left in ruins. The German 6th Army is decimated. 330,000 men are killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. One Soviet soldier writes home from the front, "Now it's over. Fritz is kaput." A half-year later, the Soviet Army begins its march to victory. June 22, 1944, the Red Army launches a final battle to liberate Soviet territory, exactly 3 years to the day that the Germans launched their invasion. Stalin placed great symbolic importance on such anniversaries. 2,400,000 Red Army troops take part in the summer offensive on the Dnieper. The offensive was planned in conjunction with the Allied invasion of France. This time, Hitler cannot relocate troops from the Western Front. The German Wehrmacht suffers its worst defeat on the Eastern Front. As they withdraw, the German army destroys everything that has not already been destroyed. In taking back territory, Soviet troops near Smolensk come across Katyn. After the defeat of Poland, 26,000 Polish officers and accused counter-revolutionaries were detained near Katyn and other places. Their fate led to an international dispute during the war. The fact is that 22,000 Poles were summarily shot and killed. Stalin set up an investigative commission. This included senior members of the Russian Orthodox Church, as well as the writer Alexei Tolstoy. This commission came to the conclusion that the Polish officers had been murdered by the Germans. A year previously, an international commission requested by the Germans declared that the atrocity had been carried out by the Russians. For decades, Katyn was an obstacle in Soviet-Polish ties. None of Stalin's successors, including Mikhail Gorbachev, ever admitted the crimes against the Polish officers had been carried out by Stalin's secret police. For 40 years, they kept the truth from both world opinion and their Polish allies. The People's Commission for Internal Affairs, a document with the simple name Package Number 1, is sent to Comrade Stalin. Completed on March 5, 1940, it is a list of the captured Poles who were executed. It is signed by Lavrenti Beria, the head of Stalin's secret police, who planned this act of mass murder. Written in pencil, it has the approval of Stalin, Voroshilov, Molotov, Mikoyan, Kalinin, and Kaganovich. Nikita Khrushchev looked at the file on April 15, 1959, as did Yuri Andropov on April 15, 1981. Mikhail Gorbachev's chief of staff, Boldin, saw it on April 18, 1989.
Товарищи, советский народ и Красная Армия успешно осуществляют задачи.
Comrades, the Soviet people and the Red Army are successfully meeting the challenges posed to them through the war for the fatherland. The Red Army carried out its patriotic duty and liberated the country from the enemy. Now and forever, we have been liberated from Nazi atrocities. Now, the Red Army has a final mission to carry out, with the help of our allies, to destroy the fascist German army, to kill the fascist beast in its own cave, and to raise the flag of victory over Berlin.
Фашистского зверя в ее собственном логове и водрузит над Берлином знамя победы.
In the second half of 1944, the Red Army launches an offensive in the Balkans. Within a month, both Bulgaria and Romania were overrun. The Soviets were welcomed and Stalin was cheered. But Stalin did not plan to bring freedom to the countries of Eastern Europe. He said, "This war is different from those of the past. Whoever occupies an area may impose their own social system there. Each side can bring its own system to those territories which it conquers. It cannot be otherwise." Only Yugoslavia, under the legendary partisan leader Josip Broz Tito, manages to liberate itself. On the same day in 1944, Belgrade was entered by both the Red Army unit and Tito's partisan army. A brotherly kiss seals the separately fought but joint victory over the German fascists. This unique situation enhanced Tito's image, including in Moscow. But when Tito insists on maintaining Yugoslavia's national integrity in 1948, Stalin then brands him a Nazi and a Trotskyist and accuses Tito of murder and sabotage. Yalta on the Crimea. In early February of 1945, Yalta hosts the meeting of the Big Three: Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. The photo opportunity fails to capture the tensions between the three leaders over the fruits of their wartime victory, specifically the fate of Germany and the future of Eastern Europe. Stalin says he will not tolerate any interference by the Western powers into this region. Above all, he wants to control Poland. The West stands by as Stalin creates facts on the ground in both Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany. The Red Army marches on despite heavy resistance. In early April of 1945, the Red Army occupies the Hungarian capital Budapest. With that, Stalin now has almost all of southeastern Europe under his control. As the tanks of the Red Army roll into Vienna, the first Soviet troops enter German territory. Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia, falls on April 9. 2 weeks later, a Katyushka rocket has the message, "To the Reichstag," painted on it. Before the Battle of Berlin, the poet Ilya Ehrenburg wrote, Germany, it is too late. You can only turn and twist in this battle to the death. The hour for vengeance has arrived. Berlin falls on May 2nd, 1945. A week later, the war in Europe is over. Victory is engraved on this medal, which Stalin has had especially designed for this occasion. The first one, of course, goes to the Generalissimo, Stalin's latest title. Stalin calls the Russians the heroic people of the Soviet Union. The summer of 1945, all of Berlin is under Soviet control. 4 years earlier, on the day the Germans attacked Russia, Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The breath of history can be heard, a great and wonderful time when a new empire is born. Despite some pain and suffering, it continues to rise towards the light." At the end of April, Stalin has a group of German communists known as the Ulbricht Group flown from Moscow to Berlin. Their activities as propagandists begin immediately. Posters with Stalin's picture and statements are put up. These state things such as history shows that Hitler's come and go, but the German state and German people remain. The Ulbricht Group's mission is to ensure that the reins of power in Germany stay in Soviet hands. The Potsdam Conference opens on July 17, 1945. Churchill is there, as is Truman, the new American president. It was at this meeting that Stalin reached his pinnacle of international recognition. The differences between these unequal allies flare up again at the negotiating table. Stalin fears a resurgent Germany. He plans to prevent this through harsh peace terms. The Western powers contradict this. The Cold War looms on the horizon. Stalin thinks he's being toyed with at the Potsdam Conference. Stalin complains the Russians may be a simple people, but all too often the West has assumed they are fools. One day before the Potsdam Conference, the Americans test their first atomic bomb. Stalin immediately orders his secret police chief, Beria, to speed up development of a Soviet nuclear bomb, whatever the cost. This goal is reached in 1949 when the Soviet Union joins the United States as the world's only nuclear powers. This marks the start of the Soviet Union's rise as a superpower to rival American influence around the globe. Following victory, the Soviet Union tallies up its losses. 20 million dead, 25 million homeless, 680 billion rubles in damages, 17,000 cities and 70,000 towns and villages are destroyed. No other country has ever suffered as much during a war. Offers of aid from the West are rebuffed. Stalinism survives its harshest test, but at a very high price. The country is shattered and the people are exhausted. People are living in caves, in holes in the ground, and in open fields. The accomplishments of an entire generation have been completely destroyed. Help is once again needed to clear away the damage. Young people from all over the Soviet Union flock to help rebuild the destroyed Western republics of the USSR. Many hope that life will become better. The people have proven their patriotism through their suffering and sacrifice in the Great War for the fatherland, but hopes for a better life fade rapidly. Artist collectives, which a few months previously had painted portraits of soldiers or heroes of the front, now painted heroes of the Reconstruction. Focus is given to rebuilding industry, which reached pre-war levels in 1948. But no fresh winds blow through Soviet society after the end of the war.
Действительно, после Второй мировой войны
After the end of the Second World War, it appeared as if much of this vast country was at a standstill. Of course, they rebuilt what had been destroyed. New factories and hydroelectric plants, new atom bombs were tested, and work on the space program was launched. But everything appeared to be standing still from a social and spiritual point of view.
После Октябрьского
Why?
переворота прошло уже
It had been 30 years since the October Putsch. In these 3 decades, a new generation was formed, which followed the regime and the party, who had been drilled to cheer and praise the party.
Которые уже приучились дружно поднимать руку, по команде кричать «Ура!», по команде, так сказать,
It was a generation that was easily manipulated.
Сформировались новое поколение людей, которыми уже можно было манипулировать.
That's one of the reasons.
Это во-первых. Во-вторых, это затишье перед концом смерти, перед концом жизни диктатора, смертью Сталина.
This sense of stagnation just prior to Stalin's death can be explained by the fact that Stalin had eliminated all potential opponents. There was hardly anyone left to challenge him.
Не осталось ни одного видного человека, который мог бы бросить вызов, который мог бы возвысить голос, который мог бы что-то сказать.
Thirdly, there was the feeling that the situation could not be this stagnant forever.
Исторически предчувствуя, что так вечно продолжаться не может. И когда умер Сталин, даже его все бонзы...
After Stalin died, even his yes men, people like Khrushchev, Beria, Malenkov, Molotov, and the other leaders realized that something had to change, that they could now blame Stalin for everything which had gone wrong.
Свалить все на Сталина, обвинить Сталина во всем этом.
Even New Year's was dominated by the tradition of praising Stalin.
Let's drink to new historic deeds, to our homeland, to peace, and to our great Stalin.
To an even bigger, greater harvest, to our collective, to Stalin. To that apostle of peace, the dearest person on the planet, Comrade Stalin.
In the post-war era, he was praised and celebrated to unprecedented levels. Cities, villages, streets, squares, ships, schools, factories, and collectives were named after him. Monuments portrayed him as an uber-father figure, strict but fair, good and godlike. The sculptor and Stalin Award winner Zair Isakovich Asgur created these monuments.
Когда уже Сталин был Сталин, когда он стал любимым народом всем.
At that time, Stalin was loved by everyone. We began to work with Vucetich on the figure of Stalin. I was given the job because a commission called by Patolichev liked my Stalin better. It was this figure here, right where I'm sitting. First, the model was made, and then it was cast to the desired scale.
A newsreel shows the young Asgur at work and his contribution to the cult of the leader. The dedication of Asgur's Stalin monument, cast in bronze and 12 meters high. It was to be raised on the main plaza in the Belarusian capital Minsk, Stalin Square, which was right next to the city's busiest street, Stalin Prospect. Belarusian party leaders and hundreds of thousands of others came to pay tribute to their leader. The writer Leonid Leonov once wrote, "The day will come when all of humanity will praise Stalin, and historians will recognize that our calendar should be based on the birth of Stalin and not Jesus Christ." The election to the Supreme Soviet approaches.
Our whole lives, all of our accomplishments, and all of our victories have been linked to the name of our dear comrade Stalin. I propose nominating our genial leader, friend and teacher, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, as a candidate to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR.
Stalin was called on to be a candidate and agreed to the proposal. The entire workforce was expected to swear their allegiance to Stalin.
Comrades, it is with great joy and pride that we vote for Stalin, because he is peace and victory. Under Stalin's name, the Soviet people will be victorious through peaceful work in the factories and the collectives. In Stalin's name, we will construct the great building of communism.
After these words, there was nothing left to do but agree. Once again, Stalin had scored a victory.
People often say, okay, Stalin was a dictator. He was a terrible person who led us into a historical catastrophe. But millions of people followed him. Millions supported him. Millions believed in him and would even say they loved him. Why? Me, for example, I was a Stalinist when I was a young lieutenant, and that was at the time when my father had been executed and my mother sent into exile where she died. I don't know why. I guess I hoped that it was a misunderstanding and that Stalin had no involvement. Basically, the whole country believed in Stalin. What was the origin of this blind fanatical faith? Lenin and Stalin both told the people they would have to be patient and frugal, but that in 10 to 15 years that paradise in the form of a bright communist future would arrive. It's right there, behind this mountain. Before one can reach paradise, enemies must be destroyed. Be merciless, work very, very hard, spy on one another and be vigilant. Spies are everywhere, enemies are everywhere, and Stalin thought for all of us. Stalin is wise, Stalin knows everything.
И Сталин думает за нас всех. Сталин мудрый, Сталин все знает.
Election Day. The Supreme Soviet is the highest-ranking body in the USSR. Its chairman is also the head of state. According to the Constitution, Stalin himself was never head of state. He ruled alongside and above state institutions, although he never dismantled them. On paper, the Soviet Union was not a dictatorship. All citizens had the right to cast a direct and secret ballot, only there was nothing to vote for. Stalin never attended university, yet in his final years he began to consider himself to be a theorist. He assigned experts to write books which were then published under Stalin's name. And of course, Stalin was the favorite subject of all Soviet artists. Stalin with his mother, Stalin as a friend of Lenin's, and even more frequently, Stalin as a military field commander. There were no exhibitions in which Stalin was not at the center of attention. He was to be thanked for everything, including the Soviet atomic bomb, as described in a song performed by a Red Army choir.
Comrade Stalin announced that we will test an atom bomb, now and in the future and evermore. The atom bombs will be, the atom bombs are. One has to protect oneself. We don't plan to destroy others. The bombs should be banned, because only the peaceful atom brings happiness into the home. You only want to ban others from building a bomb. The bomb should only serve your interests and bandits. Hey, hey, your plans are full of lies. That must be told to the people. We are satisfied with our work. Our atom bomb is a good thing, a jewel of a bomb which was only tried once. Oh, go, go, we haven't been lazy, we've worked hard for the good of the people.
The people took care of themselves as best they could. Since there was no place in public life which was off limits from Stalin's party and the police, many Soviet citizens sought refuge in their private lives. Many sought refuge in nature, snow, sun, sport, and play. A fire to sing some old Russian songs around, and if one was lucky, with a bottle of vodka. To rest until a little before things tensed up again. Stalin's 70th birthday, activities are underway all over the USSR to mark the Jubilee. People are expected to write poems, to organize and prepare events, and to make handicrafts to honor the great leader, including one portrait made out of 150,000 pieces of wood. The birthday marks a new milestone in the leader's cult of personality.
Our dear father, accept from us, the Belarusian pioneers, our warmest greetings on your 70th Jubilee. We Soviet children are the happiest in the entire world. We grow up under your watchful and tireless care, warmed by your fatherly love. We can live in such a beautiful and happy atmosphere because on our earth is our great and wonderful Stalin. To the great Stalin, glory, glory, glory.
The main event took place in the Bolshoi Theater. Statesmen from all over the socialist world were there, including Mao Zedong and, naturally, Walter Ulbricht. Stalin had exported his system and its ingredients throughout Eastern Europe. The cult of personality, show trials, labor camps, even Stalinist architecture such as the Palace of Culture in Warsaw. Heavy industry was built in the people's democracies on the Soviet model. When the 34th anniversary of the October Revolution was celebrated, nothing appeared to be able to move the Soviet system. The Iron Curtain sharply divided the East from the West. Inside the USSR, state terror was once again raising its head. The death penalty was reintroduced, leading functionaries were executed, and a wave of purges swept through Eastern Europe's communist parties. Fears of massive repression were widespread. The masses usually only saw Stalin in his oversized pictures. The man himself avoided public appearances. Behind his back, the power struggle was on for his successor. In 1951, Stalin was missing from the traditional parade to mark the anniversary of the revolution, but no one dared take his place. The legendary Man of Steel lived on as an old and ghostly figure.
И очень следил последние годы за здоровьем. Мало кто знает, что в 50-м...
In his final years, he took great care of his health. Few people knew that starting in 1950 he would travel to the warmer climate of the southern USSR every August and would remain there for 3 or 4 months until the new year. Everyone thought he was in Moscow. Often, one could see him lying on a chair on the beach. Of course, he was surrounded by bodyguards, but they were out of sight. He would sit in his chaise lounge with a coat on and spend hours staring at the sea.
Он просто думал, как много он добился, что на этими горами, где он сидел на Кавказе...
He was certainly thinking about the path his life had taken, that he grew up in these same Caucasus mountains and almost became a priest, and that if he had, he might be long dead. But instead, he became the leader of a superpower. I don't think he regretted anything. The only thing he was afraid of was death. I know about his conversations with Proskrebichev and other close associates. He spoke about death often and was terrified of it. Usually, old people don't fear death, but this man, who was like a god on earth, did not want to go from this world into the next. He felt he should be allowed to lead forever, yet all earth-bound gods remain mortal.
Stalin died on March 5, 1953. Pravda reported, "The heart of our brother in arms has stopped beating." Lenin's successor, the wise leader and teacher of the Communist Party and the Soviet people, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. The masses mourned his passing. His political heirs thought of his legacy, the future, and the party. Only 2 days after his funeral, Pravda quit publishing articles praising Stalin. Weeks later, his name was barely mentioned officially. But accounts were only truly settled in 1956, 3 years after his death. In a secret speech to the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev cursed the dead leader as a bad Leninist, an egomaniac, and a sadistic killer of good communists. The glorious Communist Party refused to admit being a participant in Stalin's crimes. The good name of the party had to be protected. And yet even Stalin's successors would have had a difficult time distancing themselves from the legacy of Stalinism until Mikhail Gorbachev.
I would just like to stress that the leader does not drive the system drives the leader. Even a prominent leader such as Gorbachev, who will go down in history as an important figure, was a prisoner of this system and could not change it. Basically, he too thought like the system. Only gradually, step by step, did he move beyond this mentality and help the country free itself from its Bolshevik chains. We have to assume that Gorbachev knew about the crimes at Katyn, but he could not speak about it publicly. He lacked the courage because the system would not allow it. Gorbachev also knew that a Soviet invasion of Poland had been planned in 1981 before the Polish communists declared martial law. I myself took part in the planning, including an attack on Poland. But Gorbachev did not dare speak about it publicly. As I said, he lacked the strength and the courage to tell it like it was. Gorbachev was a cog in the system. He was fully aware, and it tormented him, but he was not in a position to throw off totalitarianism.
The party leadership agreed to display Stalin's corpse alongside Lenin's in the mausoleum on Red Square. On the day of the funeral, March 9, 1953, people in the socialist countries were urged by their governments to remember the dead leader. In 1961, Stalin's embalmed body was removed and buried in the Kremlin wall alongside other Soviet dignitaries. This remained uncontroversial until the collapse of the Soviet Union.